The train had smelled like hope. 3 days of cinders and strangers, and Naomi had clutched those letters until the ink nearly smeared beneath her thumbs. Dearest Naomi, they'd started. Always dearest. Montana needs women of character. I need a woman of character. She'd read them so many times she'd memorized the loops in his handwriting, the way he signed off. Yours in anticipation, Thomas Farrow. Anticipation. She'd felt plenty of that, rattling west with everything she owned crammed into a trunk her father had built before the consumption took him. Her mother had gone 2 winters earlier. The Philadelphia boarding house where she'd worked had no use for a girl with no references and a cough that wouldn't quit, even after the winter broke. So when the advertisement appeared, Gentleman Rancher seeks companionship and partnership in Montana territory, she'd answered. The correspondence had been proper. Cautious at first, then warmer. He'd written about wide skies and opportunities, about building something that mattered. She'd written back about books she'd read, about her mother's garden, about wanting a place to belong. Somewhere in those pages, she'd convinced herself belonging was waiting at the end of this track. The conductor called out Prospect Ridge just after dawn. Naomi pressed her face to the window. The town looked like someone had thrown together a handful of buildings and hoped they'd stand. Wooden structures leaned into the wind. A main street carved through mud and wheel ruts. Mountains rose in the distance, still capped with snow that looked clean and indifferent. She'd worn her best dress, navy wool with black buttons her mother had sewn on, back when hands could still grip a needle. Her hair was pinned tight. She'd scrubbed her face that morning with water from the basin, trying to look like someone worth keeping a promise for. The platform was crowded, men in rough canvas and women in faded calico, everyone moving with purpose. Naomi stepped down, her trunk landing with a thud beside her. She scanned faces, looking for the features Thomas had described in his letters. Tall, fair-haired. You'll know me by the gray coat I wear Sundays. She spotted the coat first. A man stood near the station house, gray wool catching the morning light. Fair hair, like he'd said. Tall enough. She felt her chest tighten with something close to relief. Mr. Farrow. Her voice came out smaller than intended. He turned, looked her over with an expression she couldn't place. Then his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. That's me. She waited for more. For the warmth his letters had promised, or at least basic courtesy. Instead, he tilted his head toward a group of men standing outside the saloon across the street. Boys, he called out. She showed up. The laughter started before Naomi understood what was happening. One of the men, barrel-chested, with a beard that needed trimming, whooped loud enough to turn heads. I'll be damned, Tommy. You actually got one to come. Thomas Farrow's grin widened. He wasn't looking at Naomi anymore. He was looking at his audience. Told you I could do it. 3 months of writing. She bought every word. The ground seemed to tilt. Naomi gripped her trunk to steady herself, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. The words kept coming. Read us some of those letters, Tommy. Did she really think you wanted a wife? Thomas pulled a flask from his coat, that gray coat she'd looked for like a landmark, and took a long drink. A wife? Hell, I've got better sense than that. But watching you boys squirm trying to write anything half decent was worth the trouble. Easiest $20 I ever made. $20. That's what her hope had been worth. A bar bet. Entertainment for men with nothing better to occupy their time. Naomi's throat closed up. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut him the way his laughter cut her, but the words stuck. All she could manage was standing there while the men howled and slapped Thomas's back like he'd accomplished something remarkable. What's she gonna do now? Someone called out. Thomas shrugged, already turning away. Not my problem. I wrote pretty words. Didn't promise anything beyond paper. He walked into the saloon, and his friends followed, their voices fading into the dim interior. The door swung shut. The street returned to its business. Freight wagons rolled past. A woman hurried by with a basket, not making eye contact. Naomi stood beside her trunk, feeling every eye that bothered to glance her direction. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together hard enough to hurt, trying to force them still. The train was already pulling away, black smoke trailing into a sky that stretched too wide, too empty. She had $17.04. The ticket here had cost most of what she'd saved. Going back, even if she wanted to face that humiliation, wasn't possible. You need help with that trunk, miss? The voice came from her left, A boy, maybe 14, with a thin face and careful eyes. He was looking at her luggage, not her shame, which felt like a kindness even if it wasn't meant as one. Naomi's voice cracked. She tried again. I need a boarding house, somewhere inexpensive. The boy scratched his jaw. Mrs. Calhoun rents rooms, down past the general store, White House with the crooked porch. She's particular about payment, though, wants it up front. How much? $1 a week, $2 if you want meals. $17 would buy her time, but not much of it. Naomi nodded and reached for her trunk. The boy helped her hoist it, and they started down the street. Every step felt like walking through water. She kept her eyes forward, but she felt the stares, felt the whispers starting. That's the girl Tommy fooled. Came all this way for nothing. Wonder how long before she ends up at Maple Street. Naomi knew what Maple Street meant, even in Philadelphia. Every town had one. She set her jaw and kept walking. Mrs. Calhoun's boarding house smelled like lye soap and old cabbage. The woman herself was sharp-faced and efficient, looking Naomi over with the same assessing expression you'd give a horse at market. $2 a week, including breakfast and supper. You miss a payment, you're out. I don't care what your circumstances are. Naomi counted out $8, 4 weeks, though she had no idea what she'd do when that ran out. Mrs. Calhoun took the money and handed over a key attached to a wooden tag. Room 3, upstairs, end of the hall. Outhouse is around back. You cause trouble, you're gone. That clear? Yes, ma'am. The room was barely bigger than a closet. A narrow bed, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, a basin on a stand. The window overlooked the back alley where someone had dumped a pile of crates and refuse. Naomi set her trunk down and sat on the bed. The frame creaked under her weight. This was it. This was what remained after hope got stripped away. She didn't cry. Tears felt too small for what had been taken. Instead, she unpacked her trunk with mechanical precision. 2 dresses, a spare set of undergarments, her mother's shawl, a book of poetry she'd carried from home. Each item went into its place. Dresses hung on the wall peg, undergarments in the trunk, shawl folded at the foot of the bed. When everything was arranged, she sat down again and stared at the wall until the light changed and someone rang a bell downstairs for supper. The dining room held 6 other boarders, all women. They looked up when Naomi entered, then went back to their plates without a word. Mrs. Calhoun ladled out thin stew and set a piece of bread beside each bowl. Naomi ate because not eating seemed worse, but the food had no taste. Nothing did. After supper, she went back to her room and lay down fully clothed. Sleep didn't come. She listened to footsteps in the hall, voices through thin walls, the sound of a dog barking somewhere distant. When dawn finally broke, she was still awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what came next. She had $9 left. 4 weeks of shelter, minus food beyond what Mrs. Calhoun provided. After that, nothing. The second day, Naomi walked through town looking for work. She tried the general store first. The owner, a man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked her over and shook his head before she finished asking. Got no positions, and if I did, I wouldn't hire someone with your kind of reputation. My reputation? Whole town knows why you're here. Girl who got played for a fool doesn't inspire confidence. The dressmaker said she had no need for help. The hotel owner said the same. By noon, Naomi had been turned away from every establishment on Main Street. The reasons varied. No positions available, no experience required, no interest in taking on staff. But the message was clear. She was marked. Thomas Farrow's joke had made her untouchable. She walked back to the boarding house with her stomach tight and her options narrowing. Mrs. Calhoun was sweeping the porch when Naomi arrived. Any luck? She didn't sound particularly interested in the answer. No, ma'am. Didn't figure you would. Prospect Ridge isn't kind to women without protection. She paused, broom stilling. There's always Maple Street. Clara Finch runs a house there. She'd take you on. Naomi's hands clenched. I'm not interested in that kind of work. Mrs. Calhoun shrugged. Suit yourself. But pride doesn't pay rent. That night, Naomi counted her money again. $9.04. She divided it by days, calculating how long she could stretch it if she skipped meals, if she found odd jobs, if luck bent even slightly in her direction. The numbers didn't add up to hope. On the third day, desperation drove her to the edges of town. She knocked on doors of homes set back from the main street, offering to launder clothes, mend fences, anything. Most didn't answer. Those who did looked her over and shut the door without a word. She was walking back toward the boarding house when she saw him. A man stood beside a wagon outside the livery, checking the harness on a pair of draft horses. He was tall, lean in the way of someone who worked hard and ate sparingly. Dark hair, sun-weathered skin. He moved with the economy of motion that came from doing the same tasks 1,000 times. Naomi stopped. She had nothing to lose at this point except the last shred of dignity, and that was already threadbare. "Excuse me." He looked up. His eyes were gray, the color of winter sky. He didn't smile, but he didn't look through her either. That alone felt like progress. "I'm looking for work," Naomi said. "Any kind. I can cook, clean, mend. I'm not afraid of hard labor." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're the girl from the station." Not a question. Naomi's chest tightened. "Yes? Heard about that business with Pharaoh?" His tone was flat, matter of fact. Ugly thing. She waited for the judgment, the dismissal. Instead, he turned back to his horses, adjusting a strap that didn't need adjusting. "I run a ranch about 8 miles north. Lost my cook 2 months back. Haven't found a replacement." Naomi's heart kicked against her ribs. "I can cook." "Can you work 15-hour days, haul water, tend livestock, handle a rifle if something threatens the herd?" "I can learn." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Pay is $20 a month plus room and board. You'll have your own space in the bunkhouse. Work starts at dawn, ends when it's done. You don't pull your weight, you're out. Understood?" $20 a month. It wasn't much, but it was survival. It was a chance. "Understood." "Name's Elias Vance." He held out his hand. She took it. His grip was firm, calloused, real. "Naomi Hale." "Get your things, Miss Hale. We leave in an hour." Naomi walked back to the boarding house with her spine straighter than it had been in days. She packed her trunk, settled her account with Mrs. Calhoun, and returned to the livery with 15 minutes to spare. Elias Vance helped her load the trunk into the wagon bed without comment. She climbed up onto the bench seat, and he clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, leaving Prospect Ridge behind. They rode in silence. The landscape opened up around them. Rolling grassland, distant mountains, sky that went on forever. Naomi had expected to feel relief, but what settled in her chest was closer to numbness. She'd traded one uncertainty for another. At least this one came with wages. "You know anything about ranching?" Elias asked after a while. "No." "Figured." He didn't sound bothered by it. "You'll learn or you won't. Either way, I'll know in a week. And if I don't learn fast enough, then you'll be looking for work again." Honest, at least. Naomi appreciated that more than false encouragement. The ranch appeared as the sun started its descent. A main house built from logs and stone, a barn that needed fresh paint, corrals holding a scatter of cattle and horses. Everything looked functional but worn, like it had been running on determination and limited resources for too long. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop near the barn. "Bunkhouse is through there. You'll have the south end. 2 other hands work here, Miguel and Caleb. They're decent men. You have trouble with either of them, you tell me." He helped her down and carried her trunk to the bunkhouse. The interior was dim and smelled like wood smoke and leather. He set the trunk beside a narrow bed partitioned off by a canvas curtain. "Supper's at 6. You'll cook starting tomorrow. For tonight there's stew left from yesterday. Help yourself." Then he left, his boots echoing on the plank floor. Naomi stood in the small space that was now hers. A bed, a trunk, a lantern hanging from a nail. Through the gaps in the wall, she could hear cattle lowing and the wind moving through the grass. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned by her own desperation and willingness to try. She sat down on the bed and finally, for the first time since stepping off that train, let herself breathe. The work started before sunrise. Elias knocked on the bunkhouse door while stars still crowded the sky, and Naomi dragged herself out of bed with muscles already protesting. She dressed in the dark and made her way to the main house. The kitchen was bigger than she expected, with a cast-iron stove that radiated heat and shelves stocked with basics. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, beans. Elias showed her where everything was kept, his explanations brief and practical. Men eat at 6, noon, and 6 again. You're cooking for 4. Me, Miguel, Caleb, and yourself. Keep it simple. Keep it filling. Don't burn anything. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the stove and her own inexperience. Naomi had cooked before, but never for ranch hands who'd be working physical labor all day. She started with what she knew: biscuits, bacon, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The biscuits came out unevenly browned and the bacon a little crisp, but when the men came in, they ate without complaint. Miguel was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and a quiet demeanor. Caleb looked barely 20, all nervous energy and quick smiles. They nodded to Naomi but didn't press for conversation. Elias ate in silence, his attention already on the day ahead. After breakfast, the real work began. Elias set her to hauling water from the well to the kitchen, then to the vegetable garden that had gone to weeds. She filled buckets until her shoulders burned, dumped them where directed, and went back for more. When the water was done, he handed her a hoe. Garden needs clearing. Anything that's not a vegetable, pull it. She worked through the morning, blisters forming on her palms despite trying to grip the hoe carefully. The sun climbed higher, beating down without mercy. Sweat soaked through her dress. Her back ached. But she kept going because stopping meant failing, and failing meant losing the first solid ground she'd found since stepping off that train. At noon, she cooked beans and cornbread. The men ate, thanked her briefly, and returned to work. Naomi cleaned the dishes, then went back to the garden. By the time supper rolled around, she could barely stand upright. But she fried salt pork and boiled potatoes, set the table, and served the meal without letting her exhaustion show. Elias looked at her across the table. "You hold up all right today?" "Yes, sir." "Tomorrow will be harder." It wasn't a threat, just a fact. Naomi nodded and finished her meal in silence. That night, she collapsed into bed and slept like the dead. The days blurred together, cooking, hauling, mending fence, learning to milk the 2 cows Elias kept for fresh dairy. Her hands toughened, her body adapted. The work was relentless, but it had a rhythm she could follow. Elias wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. He gave instructions, expected them followed, and said little beyond what was necessary. Miguel and Caleb were friendly enough but kept their distance. Naomi was fine with that. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to survive. 2 weeks in, Elias handed her a rifle. "You know how to shoot?" "No." "Time to learn." He taught her the basics: how to load, aim, brace for the recoil. They practiced on targets until she could hit more than she missed. Then he took her out to check on the cattle and showed her what to watch for: predators, signs of illness, anything that didn't belong. "You're going to ride fence line twice a week," he said. "You see trouble, you handle it, or you come get me. Either way, you need to know how to protect yourself." It was the closest he'd come to expressing concern for her welfare. Naomi took the rifle and learned to carry it without flinching. A month passed, then another. The ranch settled into a pattern, and Naomi found herself fitting into it despite never intending to. She woke before dawn without needing to be called. She cooked meals that the men actually complimented. She rode fence line and fixed brakes without being told. Somewhere in the routine, the sharp edge of humiliation from Prospect Ridge dulled. It didn't disappear. She still remembered Thomas Farrow's laughter, still felt the eyes of the town measuring her, but it mattered less. Out here, no one cared about her past. They cared whether she showed up and did the work. One evening, after the men had finished supper and disappeared to their own pursuits, Naomi sat on the porch of the main house and watched the sun set. The sky turned shades of orange and red, bleeding into purple as the stars emerged. Elias came out and stood beside her, coffee cup in hand. For a while, neither of them spoke. "You've done good work," he said finally. Naomi glanced at him, surprised. "Thank you." "Didn't think you'd last a week." "Neither did I." He took a sip of coffee. "You planning to stay?" It was a fair question. She could leave any time, take her wages, and try somewhere else. But the truth was, she didn't want to. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "If you'll have me." Elias nodded, still looking at the horizon. "Then you'll stay." It wasn't a declaration or a promise, just an agreement between 2 people who'd found a way to exist alongside each other without pretense or expectation. Naomi turned back to the sky, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not happiness, exactly, but maybe the beginnings of peace. The work continued, the seasons would shift, winter would come hard and spring would bring new challenges. But for now, she had a place. She had purpose. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she had something that felt like solid ground beneath her feet. That was enough. Winter came early that year, rolling down from the mountains with a vengeance that caught even the old-timers off guard. The first snow hit in late October, and by November, the ranch was locked in white that stretched to the horizon. Naomi had never seen anything like it. Snow in Philadelphia was a nuisance that turned to gray slush within days. This was different. This was absolute. "Storm's coming," Elias said one morning, staring at the sky with an expression that made Naomi's stomach tighten. "Big one. We need to get the cattle closer to the barn, stock up on feed, make sure the well doesn't freeze." Miguel and Caleb were already moving, their urgency speaking louder than words. Naomi followed Elias out into wind that cut through her coat like it wasn't there. They worked through the day, driving cattle into the near pastures, hauling hay from the storage shed, covering the well with layers of canvas and wood. By the time darkness fell, Naomi's fingers were numb despite her gloves, and her face felt like someone had taken sandpaper to it. The storm hit that night. Wind screamed around the buildings, rattling shutters and finding every gap in the walls. Snow came sideways, piling against doors and windows until the world outside disappeared into white chaos. Naomi lay in her bunk listening to the violence of it, wondering if the roof would hold. It held. Barely. Morning revealed drifts high as a man's chest and a temperature cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Elias knocked on the bunkhouse door before dawn. "Need you in the main house. Stove there puts out more heat." Naomi gathered what she needed and fought her way through knee-deep snow to the kitchen. Elias had already stoked the fire, and the warmth hit her like a wall. She shed her outer layers and started breakfast, aware of Elias moving through the house, checking windows, reinforcing weak spots. Miguel and Caleb struggled in half an hour later, covered in snow and breathing hard. "Lost part of the south fence," Miguel reported, shaking ice from his coat. "Couldn't see it until I nearly walked into the gap." Elias swore under his breath. "How many head got out?" "Can't tell. Maybe a dozen, maybe more. We'll have to wait until the wind dies down. No point looking for them in this." They ate breakfast in tense silence. Losing cattle meant losing money, and the ranch operated on margins thin enough that a dozen head could hurt. Naomi refilled coffee cups and tried to stay out of the way while the men discussed options. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that never stopped, snow that kept falling, and cold that turned breath to ice crystals. They took turns checking on the livestock in the barn, making sure none had frozen or gotten injured. Naomi cooked, kept the fires going, and melted snow for water when the well became inaccessible. On the 4th day, the wind finally died. The silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Too complete, too heavy. Elias stood on the porch looking at landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. "We need to find those cattle," he said. "Miguel, you check east. Caleb, take the north range. I'll go west." "What about me?" Naomi asked. Elias looked at her for a long moment. "You ever track anything in snow?" "No." "Then you stay here. Keep the fires going. If we're not back by dark, don't come looking. Understood?" She wanted to argue, to prove she could handle it, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about capability. This was about not losing more than they already had. Understood. The men left just after dawn, bundled against cold that could kill in hours. Naomi watched them disappear into the white, then turned back to the house and the work waiting there. She spent the day stoking fires, preparing food they might need when they returned, and trying not to watch the sun track across the sky. Noon came and went. Afternoon stretched long. When the light started to fail and none of them had returned, fear settled in her chest like a stone. She built up the fires until the main room felt like a furnace, set coffee to brewing, laid out blankets near the stove. Then she sat by the window and waited. Miguel appeared first, just as full darkness hit. He was alone, leading his horse, moving with the careful deliberation of someone past exhaustion. Naomi met him at the door. "Found 6 head," he said, his voice rough from cold. "Penned them in the East Hollow. Lost the rest to the ravine. 6 out of 12. Better than nothing. Worse than they needed." Caleb came back an hour later, empty-handed and discouraged. Couldn't find tracks. Everything's buried. Another hour passed, then another. Miguel dozed by the fire. Caleb paced. Naomi stood at the window, straining to see movement in the darkness. When Elias finally appeared, he wasn't alone. He was half carrying something, a calf from the size of it, and limping badly. Naomi threw open the door. "Help me get this inside," Elias said through teeth that chattered despite his efforts to control them. They hauled the calf into the kitchen. The animal was half frozen, barely breathing. Elias collapsed into a chair while Miguel took over, rubbing the calf with blankets, trying to force warmth back into its body. Naomi knelt beside Elias. His left leg was at a wrong angle below the knee. "What happened?" "Horse spooked, threw me into a drift. Leg went through ice into a creek bed." He was shaking, and not just from cold. "Found this one stuck in the same spot. Couldn't leave it. Your leg is broken." "I know." Miguel looked up from the calf. "We need to set it. Tonight. Waiting will make it worse." Elias nodded, his face gray. "Do it." What followed was something Naomi would remember in fragments. Miguel heating a knife blade, Caleb holding Elias's shoulders, the sound of bone grinding as Miguel worked the brake back into alignment. Elias bit down on a leather strap and didn't scream, but the sounds he made were worse than screaming. Naomi held his hand through it, feeling his grip crush her fingers. When Miguel finally splinted the leg and stepped back, Elias passed out, his body going slack with relief. "Get him to bed," Miguel said. "He's going to need rest and time. Lots of both." They carried Elias to his room, a space Naomi had never entered, Spartan and neat, and laid him on the bed. Miguel dosed him with whiskey and something else Naomi didn't recognize. Within minutes, Elias was unconscious, his breathing deep and labored. "I'll sit with him," Naomi said. Miguel studied her. "Could be a long night." "I don't mind." The calf died just before dawn. Despite their efforts, the cold had taken too much. Miguel carried it outside without ceremony. They'd butcher it later, waste nothing. But the loss sat heavy in the morning light. Elias woke fevered and disoriented. Naomi cooled his face with wet cloths and forced water between his lips. He muttered things she couldn't understand, fragments about cattle and storms and something about a woman named Sarah. "Who's Sarah?" Naomi asked Miguel when he came to check on Elias. Miguel's expression shuddered. "His wife. She died 4 years back. Fever took her one winter, same as this." Naomi looked at Elias, thrashing in the grip of his own fever, and felt something shift in her understanding of this man. He'd built this ranch, lost someone he loved to it, and kept going anyway. The silence she'd interpreted as coldness was something else entirely, something closer to grief that had never found a way out. She stayed with him through that day and the next, sleeping in a chair when exhaustion won, waking when he grew restless. Miguel and Caleb handled the ranch work, checking in periodically but giving her space to tend him. On the third day, the fever broke. Elias woke clear-eyed and weak, his gaze finding Naomi immediately. "You should be working," he said, his voice rough. "Someone needed to make sure you didn't die." Miguel could have done it. Miguel's got other things to handle. Elias tried to sit up and failed, frustration crossing his face. "How long have I been out?" 3 days. He swore softly. "The ranch is still standing. Miguel and Caleb have it covered. You need to rest." "I don't have time to rest. You don't have a choice." They stared at each other, and something passed between them that Naomi couldn't quite name. Not affection exactly, but recognition. Two people who understood what it cost to keep going when everything wanted you to stop. "Fine," Elias said finally, "but only until I can walk." "That's going to be weeks at least." "Then you better get used to me being difficult." Despite everything, Naomi almost smiled. "I think I already am." The weeks that followed rearranged the dynamics of the ranch in ways no one had planned. With Elias confined to bed, Miguel took over the day-to-day operations. Caleb stepped up to handle tasks he'd previously avoided, and Naomi found herself acting as intermediary, carrying messages between Elias and the men, making decisions about supplies and schedules when Elias was too exhausted to care. She also found herself talking to Elias in ways she never had before. Confined to his room, bored and frustrated, he actually engaged in conversation instead of grunting responses and disappearing to work. "Where'd you learn to cook?" he asked one afternoon while she changed the dressing on his leg. My mother. She worked in a boarding house kitchen before she got sick. I helped when I was old enough to reach the stove. She teach you anything else? How to read, how to sew, how to keep going when you don't think you can. Naomi tied off the bandage, trying to be gentle even though she knew it hurt. She died 2 winters before I came here. I'm sorry. So am I. She collected the soiled bandages. Miguel told me about Sarah. Elias's expression closed. He had no business. He barely said anything, just her name and that she died. Naomi met his eyes. I'm not asking for details, but it helps explain some things. Like what? Like why you live like a man who's already lost everything that matters. The words hung between them, sharper than she'd intended. Elias looked away, jaw tight. I manage. You survive. That's not the same thing. And you're an expert on the difference? I'm learning to be. He didn't respond to that, and Naomi didn't push. She left him to his thoughts and went to start supper, aware that she'd crossed some line, but not sure if she regretted it. That night, lying in her bunk, she thought about the woman Elias had loved and lost, wondered what Sarah had been like, whether she'd loved this harsh land or merely endured it, whether she'd been happy here or if this ranch had taken from her the way it took from everything. The questions didn't have answers, and Naomi let them drift away into sleep. By mid-December, Elias could hobble around on a crutch Miguel had fashioned from a tree branch and some padding. He hated it, hated the weakness it represented, but he used it because the alternative was staying bedridden. Naomi watched him push himself too hard, doing too much too soon, and bit her tongue. He wasn't a child who needed scolding. He was a man fighting to reclaim what injury had stolen. She understood that better than most. Christmas came without fanfare. Miguel rode into town and came back with supplies and a letter for Naomi from the boarding house in Philadelphia, forwarded through Mrs. Calhoun. She opened it, expecting nothing, and found exactly that. A brief note saying her old room had been rented and her mail would no longer be accepted there. She burned the letter in the stove and didn't mention it to anyone. Elias noticed anyway. Bad news? Just the past reminding me it's got no use for me. Past's overrated anyway. Naomi glanced at him. He was standing by the window, looking out at snow-covered fields. His profile was sharp against the winter light, and for the first time she noticed details she'd overlooked before. The scar above his left eyebrow, the way his shoulders carried tension even when he was still, the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind for years. You ever think about leaving? She asked. Every winter. He shifted his weight, grimacing. Never do, though. Why not? Because this place is mine. I built it, lost things to it, can't just walk away from that. Even if it's killing you? He turned to look at her then. Really look. You think staying somewhere hard is the same as dying? I think sometimes we confuse endurance with living. And sometimes, Elias said quietly, endurance is all you've got. The conversation ended there, but it echoed in Naomi's thoughts for days after. She'd come here to survive, accepted that as enough. But watching Elias drag himself through each day, watching Miguel and Caleb pour themselves into work that never seemed to ease, she wondered if survival was really all any of them wanted, or if they'd just forgotten how to want anything else. January brought a thaw, brief and treacherous. Snow melted into mud that froze again at night, creating conditions that made every step outside a gamble. One of the horses went lame stepping in a hidden hole. Caleb fell and cracked 2 ribs. The roof over the barn developed a leak that required climbing up in conditions that made Naomi's heart stop every time Miguel ascended the ladder. Through it all, Elias grew stronger. By February, he'd discarded the crutch, though he still limped. He threw himself back into ranch work with the intensity of someone making up for lost time, and Naomi watched him wear himself down to nothing. You're going to break something else, she said one evening, finding him in the barn long after supper. I'm fine. You're exhausted. That's my business. It becomes everyone's business when you collapse and we have to carry you inside again. Elias turned on her, frustration finally breaking through. What do you want from me, Naomi? You want me to sit around doing nothing while the ranch falls apart? You want me to be grateful I'm alive and not care that I'm losing ground every day I can't work? I want you to stop acting like you're the only person here who's invested in this place surviving. The words came out harder than she intended, and Elias blinked like she'd slapped him. What's that supposed to mean? It means Miguel's been running this ranch for months, and you haven't thanked him once. It means Caleb's working with cracked ribs, and you haven't told him to rest. It means I've been cooking and cleaning and managing supplies, and you've barely acknowledged it. Naomi's hands were shaking, but she kept going. You're so busy punishing yourself for being human that you can't see the people around you trying to hold this place together with you. Silence filled the barn. Somewhere in the loft, mice scratched at the hay. The horses shifted in their stalls, unconcerned with human drama. I don't... Elias stopped, started again. I'm not trying to punish anyone. Just yourself, then. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized. The same relentless need to prove worth through suffering that she'd carried since Prospect Ridge. The same inability to accept help without seeing it as failure. I don't know how to do this differently, he said finally. Neither do I, Naomi admitted. But maybe we could figure it out together. The words hung there, meaning more than either of them had intended. Elias rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. I should thank Miguel. Yes, you should. And tell Caleb to ease up. That too. And you... He paused. I should have said something before now, about the work you do. It matters. I know it does. You do? Naomi almost smiled. I'm not waiting for your approval, Elias. I just want your acknowledgement that we're all in this together. He nodded slowly. We are. I forget that sometimes. Then try to remember. She left him there and walked back to the house, her heart beating faster than the conversation warranted. Something had shifted between them, some barrier coming down brick by brick. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she felt it. March came in fierce, then gentled as spring fought its way north. Snow retreated to shaded hollows and the higher elevations. Grass began showing through in patches, bright green against the dull brown of winter-killed vegetation. The cattle grew restless, ready for open range. Elias called a meeting one evening after supper. Miguel and Caleb gathered in the main room while Naomi poured coffee, sensing this was important. We lost 16 head over the winter, Elias began without preamble. Between the storm and the cold snap in January, we're down a third of what we started with. That's not sustainable. Miguel nodded. Spring calves will help, but not enough to make up the loss. Which means we need to expand, take on more land, increase the herd, or find another income source. Elias looked at each of them. Any of those options requires capital we don't have. Could take out a loan, Caleb suggested. Already maxed when the bank will lend me. Elias's jaw was tight. Fact is, we're running on borrowed time. One more winter like this last one, and we're done. The words settled over them like weight. Naomi had known the ranch operated on thin margins, but hearing it stated so baldly was different. There might be another option, Miguel said slowly. I heard in town there's a buyer looking for horse stock. Good riding horses, not just work animals. Pays premium prices. Elias frowned. We don't breed horses. No, but we could start. Use some of the rangeland for a breeding program. Horses eat less than cattle, sell for more, and there's less risk in winter. I don't know the first thing about breeding horses. But I do. Miguel leaned forward. Worked on a horse ranch in California before I came here. Know the bloodlines. Know what buyers want. You give me space to work and a budget for decent stock, I can build something. Elias was quiet for a long moment. That's a big shift. So is going under. He's right, Naomi said, surprising herself. 3 heads turned toward her. You need to try something different, or you're going to end up exactly where you're afraid of ending up anyway. Elias looked at her, then at Miguel. You really think you can make this work? I think it's worth trying. All right. The decision seemed to cost him something. We'll shift focus. Keep enough cattle for income, put the rest of the resources into building a horse operation. Miguel, you're in charge of that. Caleb, you'll help him. Naomi. He stopped, and she saw him recalculate, actually considering what she might contribute, instead of just assigning her to cooking. Naomi, you've been managing supplies and coordinating work. Keep doing that. We're going to need someone tracking what we spend and making sure we don't overextend. It wasn't much, but it was recognition. Acknowledgement that she contributed more than meals and clean laundry. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. When do we start? Caleb asked. Soon as the ground's solid enough to build new corrals. Miguel, make a list of what you need. Let's see if we can pull this off. The meeting broke up, but Naomi stayed behind, collecting coffee cups. Elias lingered by the fire, staring into the flames. You think I'm making a mistake? He asked, without looking at her. I think you're making a choice. That's different than a mistake. What if it doesn't work? What if it does? He glanced at her, almost smiling. You always this optimistic? I'm not optimistic. I'm just tired of watching everything be hard without anything changing. Change isn't always good. Neither is staying the same. Elias nodded, still looking at the fire. Sarah used to say something similar, said I was too stubborn to see opportunities when they were right in front of me. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife directly to Naomi. She set down the cups she'd been gathering. Was she right? Usually. His voice was quiet. She wanted to expand, try new things. I kept saying we needed to be careful, stick with what worked. Then she died, and I spent 4 years doing exactly what I'd always done, wondering why it felt like I was just going through motions. You're not going through motions now. No. He looked at her then, really looked. I'm not sure when that changed. The air between them felt charged with something Naomi couldn't name. She should have made an excuse and left, put distance between whatever this was and what they needed to keep being, employer and employee, two people working toward the same goal without complication. Instead, she stayed. I think it changed when you stopped trying to do everything alone, she said. When you forced me to, you mean? I didn't force anything. I just pointed out what was already true. Elias shook his head, but he was almost smiling. You're trouble, Naomi Hale. So I've been told. The moment stretched, then broke when Miguel knocked on the doorframe. Need to talk about those supply numbers if you've got time. Elias straightened, the vulnerability disappearing behind his usual reserve. Yeah, let's do it now. Naomi finished collecting the dishes and left them to their planning, but the conversation stayed with her long into the night. Spring unfolded in fits and starts, warm days followed by freezing nights, sunshine interrupted by late storms that dumped wet snow and turned the roads to soup. Miguel and Caleb started building new corrals, working when weather allowed. Elias made a trip to town and came back with plans to acquire breeding stock from a ranch 2 territories over. Going to cost most of what we've got saved, he told Naomi one evening, showing her the figures. But if Miguel's right about demand, we could recoup it in 2 years. And if he's wrong, then we're in the same hole we're in now, just deeper. Naomi studied the numbers, doing calculations in her head. You'll need to cut spending everywhere else, on no new equipment, no repairs that aren't critical. I know. And someone's going to have to make that trip to acquire the horses. 2 territories is a week there, a week back, plus however long it takes to assess stock and negotiate. Elias nodded. Miguel and I will go. Caleb can handle things here. What about me? He looked surprised she'd asked. What about you? I could go? I'm good with numbers, good at spotting when someone's trying to cheat you, and I've been reading everything Miguel's got on horse breeding. I probably know as much about bloodlines now as you do. It's a rough trip. I've handled rough before. Elias studied her, and she could see him weighing whether to allow it. Part of her bristled at needing permission, but the practical side understood he was calculating risk. You'd be the only woman traveling with 2 men. People will talk. People already talk. I stopped caring in Prospect Ridge. That got through. Elias nodded slowly. All right, you can come, but you follow orders, and if things get dangerous, you don't argue. Same terms you'd give Miguel or Caleb? Fair enough. They left the first week of May when the roads had dried enough to handle a wagon. 3 horses, supplies for 2 weeks, and money Elias kept in a leather pouch that never left his body. Naomi sat beside Elias on the bench while Miguel rode ahead on one of the spare mounts, scouting the route. The landscape changed as they traveled, grassland giving way to rolling hills, then to forest that still held patches of snow in the shadowed places. They camped at night, taking turns on watch, eating beans and hardtack and coffee that tasted like mud. You regret coming yet? Elias asked on the 3rd night, watching Naomi try to find a comfortable position on ground that offered none. Ask me in the morning. He smiled at that, a real smile that changed his whole face. Naomi felt something warm settle in her chest and firmly ignored it. The ranch they were heading to belonged to a man named Garrett Webb, who had a reputation for breeding quality horses and driving hard bargains. Miguel had dealt with him before and warned them to expect resistance. "He'll try to sell you the worst stock at premium prices," Miguel said as they approached the property. "Don't let him rush you. Inspect everything." Webb's ranch sprawled across a valley, buildings well-maintained and horses grazing in paddocks that spoke of care and investment. The man himself met them in the yard, barrel-chested, graying, with eyes that assessed them like merchandise. "Miguel Santos, heard you were dead." "Heard the same about you, Garrett." Webb laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling. "Who are your friends?" "Elias Vance, Naomi Hale. We're looking to buy breeding stock, good stock, not the culls you try to pawn off on everyone." "I don't sell culls." Webb's gaze lingered on Naomi. "Unusual, bringing a woman along on a buying trip." "Miss Hale handles our finances," Elias said, his tone flat. "She's here to make sure we get what we pay for." Something in his voice made Webb's expression shift from amused to cautious. "Well then, let's see what I've got that meets your standards." They spent 2 days inspecting horses, watching them move, checking teeth and legs and temperament. Webb tried every trick Miguel had warned them about, showing tired horses in dim light, rushing them through inspections, praising animals that had obvious flaws. Naomi watched and learned, taking notes in a small book she'd brought. She saw Elias and Miguel work together, their communication almost wordless. She saw how they tested Webb, pushing back on inflated prices, walking away from deals that didn't make sense. On the third day, they'd narrowed it down to 6 horses, 3 mares and 3 geldings, all with bloodlines that could produce the kind of stock buyers wanted. Webb named a price that made Elias's jaw tighten. "That's robbery. That's fair value for prime stock. It's 30% over market." "Market doesn't account for the time I've invested in these animals." Naomi stepped forward. "Market also doesn't account for the cracked hoof on the bay mare or the old injury on the gray gelding's left foreleg, both of which reduce value by at least 15% each." Webb's eyes narrowed. "That injury's healed, but it'll affect performance. Any buyer who knows horses will see it." Naomi kept her voice level. "Your stock is good, Mr. Webb, but it's not flawless. Price it honestly, and we'll deal. Price it for fools, and we'll go elsewhere." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Then Webb laughed, that same rumbling sound. "She's got spine. All right, let's talk real numbers." They negotiated for another hour, Naomi and Elias working as a team, pushing until Webb came down to a price that still hurt, but felt fair. When they finally shook on it, Webb looked at Naomi with something like respect. "You ever need work, girl, you come see me. I could use someone with your eye." "I've got work, thank you." The trip back was slower, managing the horses they'd purchased. But the mood was lighter, the success of the deal lifting spirits. Even Miguel smiled more, clearly pleased with the stock they'd acquired. "You did good back there," Elias said to Naomi one evening as they made camp, "with Webb." "I just paid attention to what you and Miguel were doing. You did more than that. You saw things we missed." He was quiet for a moment. "Sarah would have liked you. She had the same kind of steel underneath." It was the highest compliment Naomi had received from him, and she felt it settle somewhere deep. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You earned it." That night, sitting by the fire with Miguel already asleep and the horses grazing nearby, Naomi felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the brittle kind that came from defending against humiliation, but the solid kind that came from doing something well and having it acknowledged. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked, noticing her expression. "How different this is from where I started." "You mean Philadelphia?" "I mean Prospect Ridge. Standing in that train station thinking my life was over." She looked at the fire, watching sparks rise into darkness. "If someone had told me then that I'd end up here doing this, I wouldn't have believed them." "You think that's good or bad?" "I think it's just true." She glanced at him. "What about you? Is this where you thought you'd end up?" "No." His face was shadowed, hard to read. "I thought I'd build this place with Sarah, raise kids, grow old watching something we'd created together flourish. Didn't plan on doing it alone." "You're not alone." "No," he agreed quietly. "I'm not." The words hung between them, weighted with meanings neither quite voiced. Naomi felt it, the shift happening inch by inch, day by day, changing what they were to each other without either of them deciding it should change. She should have been scared, should have pulled back, kept the careful distance that had served her well. But sitting there under stars that stretched forever, having just proven herself capable of more than she'd imagined, she found she didn't want distance. She wanted whatever this was becoming. They returned to the ranch to find Caleb had managed fine in their absence, though he looked relieved to see them. The new horses were integrated into the small herd they'd started, and Miguel threw himself into the work of beginning a breeding program with the intensity of someone who'd finally found purpose beyond just surviving. Summer came on fast and hot, the kind of heat that made everything shimmer and turned the sky white by midday. Naomi worked in the garden she'd expanded, coaxing vegetables from soil that fought her every step. She managed the household, tracked expenses, and found herself increasingly involved in decisions about the ranch's direction. Elias consulted her now, actually asked her opinion instead of just issuing orders. Miguel treated her like a partner in planning. Even Caleb, young and uncertain, looked to her for guidance when Elias wasn't around. She'd become essential, without quite meaning to. The realization hit her one evening when Elias mentioned hiring additional help for the fall. "We'll need someone who can handle the horses while Miguel focuses on breeding decisions," he said over supper. "Can't afford much, but maybe we can find someone willing to work for room and board plus a small wage." "Someone like I was," Naomi said. Elias paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Yeah, I suppose so." "And you'll give them the same chance you gave me?" "If they're willing to work, yes." She nodded, satisfied. "Then I'll help interview candidates when the time comes." It was assumed now. Her involvement, her say in how things ran. She'd gone from hired cook to something more, and no one had bothered to formalize the shift. It had just happened, the way ice melted or grass grew, natural and inevitable. That night, unable to sleep, Naomi walked out to the porch and sat on the steps. The air had finally cooled, bringing relief from the day's heat. Stars crowded the sky so thick she could have reached up and grabbed handfuls. The door opened behind her. Elias stepped out, settling onto the step beside her with a grunt. "Can't sleep either." "Too much thinking," Naomi admitted. "About what?" "About how strange it is that I'm happy here." She said it without planning to, the words just coming. "I didn't expect that. Didn't even know I was looking for it." Elias was quiet, and when he spoke his voice was rough. "I didn't expect it either. Any of this." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I thought I was done. After Sarah died, I figured I'd work this ranch until it killed me, or I got too old to care. Didn't think about anything beyond that." He looked at her, his expression barely visible in the darkness. "Then you showed up, all stubborn determination, and refused to quit, and suddenly I had to start thinking about more than just getting through the next season." Naomi's heart was beating too fast. "Is that good?" "I don't know yet." He paused. "But I think it might be." They sat there in the summer darkness, not touching but aware of each other in ways that went beyond physical proximity. Naomi knew they were standing at a threshold, that crossing it would change everything. She also knew she was tired of being careful, tired of protecting herself from possibilities because she'd been burned once. "Elias, don't." He said it gently but firmly. "Not yet. I can't promise anything, Naomi. I'm still figuring out how to be something other than what I've been. I'm not asking for promises." "Then what are you asking for?" She considered the question honestly. "Time. To see where this goes without deciding it has to be anything specific." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even really an agreement, but it was acknowledgement, and for now, that was enough. The heat broke in late August with storms that rolled across the plains like artillery fire. Thunder shook the buildings, and lightning turned night into day for split seconds that left after images burned into vision. Naomi stood at the kitchen window watching the display, awed and slightly terrified by the raw power of it. "You get used to it," Elias said, coming up beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "Summer storms here make Philadelphia weather look polite. I'm not sure I want to get used to this." A crack of thunder punctuated her words, and she flinched despite herself. Elias handed her a cup. "Sarah hated them. Used to hide in the cellar until they passed." He'd been talking about Sarah more lately, small mentions woven into conversation like he was trying to make space for both past and present without letting either consume him. Naomi appreciated it, the way he was learning to hold memory without drowning in it. "What did you do?" she asked. Sat with her. Told her stories until the noise stopped scaring her. He smiled slightly. Didn't always work, but it helped. "What kind of stories?" "Made-up ones, mostly. About places I'd never been, people I'd never met. She said I was terrible at it, but she kept asking anyway." Lightning flashed again, closer this time. The horses in the barn whinnied, nervous. Elias set down his coffee. "I should check on them. Miguel's out there, but an extra pair of hands won't hurt. I'll come with you." They ran through rain that came sideways, soaking them before they'd crossed half the distance to the barn. Inside, Miguel was moving between stalls, speaking softly to the horses in Spanish. The animals were restless but not panicked, responding to his calm presence. "Everyone all right?" Elias asked. "So far. The new mare's spooked, but she'll settle." Miguel glanced at them. "You two look like drowned rats." "Feel like it too," Naomi muttered, wringing water from her braid. They stayed in the barn until the worst of the storm passed, working together to keep the horses calm. Naomi found herself next to the bay mare they'd bought from Webb, the one with the healed hoof injury. The horse was shaking, eyes rolling white. "Easy," Naomi murmured, reaching out slowly. "You're all right. Just noise." The mare's ear swiveled toward her voice. Naomi kept talking, nonsense mostly, just steady sound to cut through the fear. Gradually, the shaking eased. The mare dropped her head and blew out a breath that smelled like grass and grain. "You're good with her," Elias observed, watching from the next stall. "I just remember what it's like to be that scared." Something passed across his face. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. "Yeah, I suppose you would." When the storm finally moved on, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of ozone, they walked back to the house through mud that sucked at their boots. Naomi's dress was ruined, her hair a disaster, but she felt strangely content. There was something about working through difficulty together that created bonds words couldn't quite manage. "You should get dry," Elias said when they reached the porch. "Don't need you catching sick." "Same goes for you." He nodded, but didn't move. Just stood there looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he reached out and tucked a wet strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers rough and gentle at once. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being here, for all of it." Before Naomi could respond, he turned and went inside, leaving her standing in the aftermath of his touch, her heart doing things it had no business doing. The next morning brought cooler air and the first real hint that summer was giving way to fall. Miguel announced that one of the new mares was in foal, confirmed by her behavior and the way she was carrying herself. It was early yet, but if everything went well, they'd have their first ranch-bred foal by next spring. "That's the beginning," Miguel said with satisfaction. "Once word spreads that we're breeding quality stock, buyers will come." "Assuming we can keep everything alive through another winter," Caleb added, ever the pessimist. "We will," Elias said with a certainty that surprised everyone, including himself. "We've got a better setup now, more resources, and we know what to watch for." Naomi caught his eye across the breakfast table and saw something there that hadn't been present before. Hope, maybe. Or at least willingness to believe hope might be possible. The shift in season brought new work. Hay needed cutting and storing. The garden needed harvesting and preserving. Fences required walking and mending before winter made the job impossible. They fell into a rhythm, all four of them working dawn to dark, then collapsing into exhausted sleep. One evening in early September, a rider appeared on the road to the ranch. Strangers were rare enough to be noteworthy, and everyone stopped what they were doing to watch the approach. The man was young, maybe Caleb's age, riding a horse that had seen better days. "Help you?" Elias called out when the rider got close enough. "Looking for work," the young man said. His accent was different, something Eastern. "Heard in Prospect Ridge you might be hiring." Elias exchanged a glance with Naomi. They'd mentioned wanting extra help, but hadn't expected anyone to show up unannounced. "What kind of experience you got?" "Farmhand work mostly, some carpentry. I can handle livestock and I'm not afraid of hard labor." The young man dismounted stiffly. "Name's Daniel Pritchard. I'll work for whatever you think is fair, long as there's a place to sleep and food to eat." There was something familiar in his desperation, The way he held himself like someone braced for rejection. Naomi saw Elias recognize it too. "We can give you a trial," Elias said after a moment. "Week's work, see how you handle it. If it works out, we'll talk terms." Relief flooded Daniel's face. "Thank you, sir. You won't regret it." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen what you're signing up for." Elias gestured to Caleb. "Show him the bunkhouse and where to stable his horse. He can start tomorrow." Daniel Pritchard turned out to be exactly what he'd claimed, willing, capable, and desperate enough to prove himself that he attacked every task with intensity that sometimes bordered on reckless. Caleb took him under his wing, showing him the routines and quirks of the ranch. Miguel assessed him with the same careful eye he used on horses and pronounced him acceptable. "He'll do," was Miguel's verdict. "Needs to learn when to pace himself, but he's got the right attitude." Naomi watched Daniel work and saw echoes of herself a year ago. The determination to justify the chance given, the fear of failing and having nowhere else to go. She made sure he ate enough, that he didn't push too hard too fast, small kindnesses that might have helped her if anyone had thought to offer them. "You're mothering him," Elias observed one evening, watching her set aside extra biscuits for Daniel's breakfast. "I'm making sure he doesn't burn out before he's useful." "That what you're calling it?" Naomi shot him a look. "He reminds me of someone." "Who?" "Me, when I first got here." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You were never that green." "I was exactly that green. I just hid it better." "No," he said thoughtfully. "You were terrified and trying not to show it. That's different than green. That's survival." The observation cut closer than comfortable. Naomi turned back to the bread she was slicing, not trusting herself to respond. Elias had a way of seeing through her defenses that she both appreciated and resented. "He'll be all right," Elias added. "We'll make sure of it." The "we" settled warm in her chest. Somewhere along the line, they'd become a unit, making decisions together without having to discuss whether that was appropriate. It just was. A week became 2, and Daniel proved his worth enough that Elias offered him permanent position. $20 a month plus room and board, same terms Naomi had started with. Daniel accepted with gratitude that was painful to witness, and Naomi felt a small measure of satisfaction in knowing they'd given someone else the chance she'd received. September slid into October, and the weather turned properly cold. Frost painted the windows each morning, and the cattle grew their winter coats. Miguel worked with the horses constantly, training them, assessing which would be best for breeding, which for selling. The ranch felt different now, purposeful, in a way it hadn't before, like they were building toward something instead of just surviving until the next crisis. Naomi's role had evolved beyond anything that could be called hired help. She managed the household accounts, made decisions about supplies and expenditures, planned meals around budget and availability. When buyers came looking at horses, she stood with Elias and Miguel, contributing to negotiations with an authority no one questioned anymore. One such buyer, a rancher from 2 territories east, looked her over with barely concealed confusion. "You Vance's wife?" "No," Naomi said evenly. "I manage operations here." "Unusual setup." "Effective setup," Elias corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Miss Hale knows this ranch as well as I do. You deal with her, you deal with me." The rancher accepted this with a shrug and proceeded to negotiate the purchase of 2 geldings. When he left, having paid fair price without the usual haggling, Elias turned to Naomi with something like pride in his expression. "You handled that well. He was going to lowball us on the gray, I saw it coming, and headed it off before it became an issue. That's skill, Naomi." She felt the praise settle deep, the way it always did when Elias acknowledged her contributions. Somewhere in the past months, his opinion had started mattering more than it should, and she'd stopped pretending it didn't. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Naomi found Elias on the porch again. It had become their place, these late evening conversations where they could speak freely without audience. "We need to talk about something," Elias said without preamble. Naomi's stomach tightened. "All right. This arrangement we've got, you working here, being part of running things, it's not standard. People in town already talk." "Let them talk." "I'm serious, Naomi. Your reputation—" "My reputation was destroyed before I ever set foot on this ranch," she interrupted. "I stopped caring what Prospect Ridge thinks a long time ago." "Maybe you should start caring again." The words stung. Naomi turned to face him fully. "Why?" So I can go back to being someone's joke? So I can pretend I'm not doing exactly what I'm doing, which is helping build something that matters? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Elias ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I mean, you deserve better than being the subject of gossip. You deserve respect. I have respect. Yours, Miguel's, Caleb's, even Daniel's, and he barely knows me. That's more than I had in Philadelphia, more than I ever got in Prospect Ridge. She kept her voice level despite the anger building. If you're trying to tell me I need to leave to protect some notion of respectability, you can save your breath. I'm not telling you to leave, he said it sharply, almost desperately. I'm trying to figure out how to do right by you. Then stop worrying about what other people think and worry about what I think, what I want. And what do you want? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Naomi knew what she wanted, had known for months, but saying it out loud would change everything. Still, she was tired of caution, tired of protecting herself from possibilities. I want to stay. I want to keep building this place with you. And I want whatever this is between us to stop being something we dance around and start being something real. Silence. Elias stared at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. I'm not easy to be with, he said finally. I'm difficult and stubborn, and I carry things I maybe shouldn't. I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for honest. What if honest isn't good enough? What if it is? He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes, fear and want, past and present, all tangled together. Then he reached for her hand, his grip warm and solid. I can't promise this won't be hard, he said quietly. I can't promise I won't mess it up, or that I've got everything figured out. But I can promise I'll try. If you're willing to take that risk. Naomi's heart was beating so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. I've taken bigger risks for less. Yeah, he agreed, almost smiling. I suppose you have. He pulled her closer, and she went without hesitation, closing the distance between them until there was none left. When he kissed her, it was careful at first, tentative, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile. But Naomi had never been fragile, and she kissed him back with all the certainty she'd been holding back for months. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder than warranted, Elias rested his forehead against hers. This is going to complicate things, he murmured. Things were already complicated. Fair point. They stayed like that for a while, holding each other in the darkness, not needing words. Eventually, the cold drove them inside, but something fundamental had shifted. They'd crossed the threshold they'd been circling, and there was no going back now. The next morning, Miguel took one look at them and smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Caleb remained oblivious. Daniel was too focused on his work to notice anything beyond his immediate tasks. The ranch continued operating as it always had, but underneath everything was different. Naomi moved through her days with new awareness, constantly conscious of Elias in ways both distracting and grounding. He touched her more. Casual brushes of fingers when passing dishes, his hand on the small of her back when they walked together, small intimacies that spoke of claim and comfort. They were careful around the others, not hiding exactly, but not advertising either. What they had felt private, something that belonged to just them until they figured out what it meant. A week after that first kiss, Elias knocked on her door late one night. Naomi opened it to find him standing there with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. Can I come in? She stepped aside and he entered the small space that had been hers for over a year now. He looked around, taking in the sparse furnishings, the neat organization, the few personal items she'd accumulated. You've made this a home, he said. Best I could. I want you to move into the main house. Naomi's breath caught. Elias. Not like that, he said quickly, then reconsidered. Well, eventually, like that maybe. But right now I'm just saying you shouldn't be sleeping in a bunkhouse when there are empty rooms in the house. It doesn't make sense. People will definitely talk if I move into your house. Let them. I'm tired of making decisions based on what people might think. He moved closer. I want you there, Naomi. Not hidden away out here like you're still just hired help. You're more than that. You've been more than that for a long time. She wanted to say yes immediately, but caution held her back. What about Miguel and Caleb? Danielle? Miguel already suggested it 2 months ago. Said it was ridiculous you were still out here. Caleb won't care. Daniel's too new to have an opinion that matters. You talked to Miguel about this? He has eyes. He's known how I felt before I figured it out myself. The admission made her smile despite the seriousness of the conversation. How long have you known? That I had feelings for you? Probably since you called me out for being an ass about not thanking anyone. But I didn't let myself acknowledge it until this summer. He took her hand. And before you ask, yes, I'm sure. Yes, this is what I want. And yes, I know it's fast and complicated and maybe not the smartest decision either of us has ever made, but I'm asking anyway. Naomi looked around the small room that had been her refuge and her prison, her starting point and her safety. Leaving it felt like shedding skin, stepping into something new and uncertain. All right, she said, I'll move to the house. The relief on Elias's face was worth whatever complications would follow. They moved her belongings the next day, Caleb and Daniel helping without comment. Miguel watched with quiet approval, and when Naomi passed him carrying an armload of clothes, he simply nodded. About time, he murmured. Her new room was on the second floor, across the hall from Elias's. It was larger than the bunkhouse space, with a real window that let in morning light and a bed that didn't creak with every movement. Naomi set her trunk at the foot of the bed and looked around, feeling strangely displaced. You can change anything you want, Elias said from the doorway. Paint, furniture, whatever makes it feel like yours. It's fine as it is, Naomi. He waited until she looked at him. I mean it. This is your home now. Make it feel that way. The words settled into her bones, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she let herself believe it might be true. This could be home, not just a place she worked or a temporary stop on a journey with no destination, actually home. That night, she lay in the new bed listening to unfamiliar sounds. Floorboards settling, wind against different windows, the house breathing around her. Across the hall, she heard Elias moving around, getting ready for sleep. The proximity felt both comforting and dangerous, full of possibilities that made her pulse quicken. She'd taken the leap. Now she had to trust the landing. The weeks that followed established new patterns. Naomi woke in the main house and started breakfast while Elias tended the animals. They ate together, planned the day together, worked through challenges as partners. When problems arose, and they always did on a ranch, they solved them side by side. The shift didn't go unnoticed in Prospect Ridge. When Naomi rode into town with Elias to buy supplies, she felt the stares, heard the whispers that didn't bother to lower their volume. Living in sin, I heard. Shameless, the both of them. Should have known she'd end up someone's mistress after that business with Pharaoh. Elias's jaw tightened, but Naomi touched his arm lightly. Don't, she said quietly. It doesn't matter. The hell it doesn't. It matters to you because you think it affects me, but I stopped letting these people's opinions define me the day I left here with you. She met his eyes. I know who I am now. I know what I've built and what I'm worth. They can think whatever they want. He studied her face, then nodded slowly. You're stronger than I am. Just practiced at it longer. They finished their business and left town without incident, but Naomi felt Elias simmering beside her the whole ride home. That night, after supper, he brought it up again. I don't like you being talked about that way. Neither do I, but I like the alternative less. What alternative? Leaving. Going somewhere else to protect a reputation that was already ruined. She set down the dish she'd been washing. I'm not running again, Elias, not from gossip, not from judgment, not from anything. I found something here worth staying for. Me? You, the ranch, the life we're building, all of it. She dried her hands and turned to face him fully. If that makes me shameless, fine. I'll be shameless. Elias crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled her into a kiss that was harder, more desperate than the ones that had come before. When he pulled back, his eyes were intense. Marry me. Naomi's breath stopped. What? Marry me. Give me the right to defend you properly. Give them no ground to stand on for their gossip. That's not a good reason to get married. Then I'll give you a better one. I love you. I want you in my life permanently, legally, in every way that matters. I want to build this ranch with you and for you, and know that when I'm gone, it's yours. He cupped her face in his hands. I'm asking badly, and probably too fast, but I'm asking. Will you marry me? Naomi's heart was racing, her thoughts tumbling over each other. This was fast. This was reckless. This was everything she'd told herself she wouldn't rush into again. But it was also real. It was Elias, who'd given her a chance when no one else would. It was the life they'd built together, the partnership that had grown from necessity into something deeper. It was waking up every day knowing she mattered, knowing she was seen and valued and trusted. "Yes," she said, the word coming out strong and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across his face was worth every risk, every complication, every whispered judgment she'd ever endure. He kissed her again, slower this time, taking his time, like they had all the time in the world. Maybe they did. Maybe they were just beginning. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Miguel stood witness, along with Caleb and Daniel, and a minister Elias had convinced to ride out from Prospect Ridge. Naomi wore her best dress, the same navy wool she'd arrived in, mended and altered to fit better. Elias wore a clean shirt and had actually trimmed his hair. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken without flourish. When the minister pronounced them married, Elias kissed her with a gentleness that contrasted the roughness of everything else about their lives. "Mrs. Vance," he murmured against her lips. "Still Naomi," she corrected, but she was smiling. They celebrated with the dinner Miguel had insisted on preparing, simple food made special by the occasion. Daniel produced a harmonica and played surprisingly well, and even Caleb seemed cheerful, making toasts that bordered on inappropriate until Miguel shut him down. That night, Naomi moved her belongings across the hall into Elias's room, their room now. She'd been nervous about this moment, about the intimacy it represented, but Elias was patient, careful, making sure she felt safe before pushing for more. "We don't have to rush anything," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed while she stood by the window. "I'm not afraid. I didn't say you were, but if you need time—" "I don't need time." She turned to face him. "I need you to stop treating me like I'm fragile." That got through. Elias stood and crossed to her, and this time when he touched her, there was no hesitation, no careful handling, just want and need and the relief of finally being allowed to show it. Later, lying in the darkness, with Elias's arm around her and his breathing steady beside her, Naomi felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Complete. Not because marriage had magically fixed everything broken inside her, but because she'd found someone who saw the broken pieces and wanted her anyway. "You awake?" Elias murmured. "Yeah." "No regrets?" She considered the question honestly. "Not about this. Not about you. But about something? About the time it took me to get here. All those months I wasted being afraid." She shifted to look at him. "I could have had this sooner if I'd been braver." "You were plenty brave. You just needed to trust it would work out." His hand traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Besides, timing doesn't matter. We're here now." "Yeah," she agreed, settling back against him. "We are." They fell asleep like that, tangled together in the bed they'd share for whatever years remained to them. Two people who'd found each other in the hardest possible circumstances and decided that was worth keeping. Winter came hard that year, worse than the one before. Snow started falling in early November and didn't let up for weeks. The cold settled in deep, the kind that made metal burn skin and turned breath to ice before it left your lungs. But this time, the ranch was ready. The horse operation had brought in enough money to stock proper feed, repair buildings before they failed, and even hire Daniel permanently. Miguel's breeding program was showing results. The mare that had been in foal delivered a healthy colt in late October, and 2 more were confirmed pregnant. Buyers had started coming around asking about stock for next season. For the first time since Elias had started the ranch, they weren't just surviving winter, they were weathering it with resources to spare. Naomi stood at the kitchen window one morning, watching snow fall in sheets so thick she couldn't see the barn. Behind her, Elias was stoking the fire, and the warmth pushed back against the cold, trying to seep through every crack. "Miguel and the others all right out there?" she asked. "They're fine. Bunkhouse stove's working better than this one." Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You worry too much. Someone has to." He kissed the top of her head. "They're grown men. They can handle a storm." Naomi leaned back against him, letting herself take comfort in his solid presence. Marriage had changed some things and left others exactly as they'd been. They still worked dawn to dark, still fought over stupid things like whether to buy new equipment or make do with what they had. Still fell into bed exhausted most nights. But there were moments like this now, quiet spaces where they could just be together without purpose or agenda. Naomi had learned to treasure them. "I've been thinking," Elias said after a while. "Dangerous. I'm serious. We've got some money put away now. Not a lot, but enough that we could expand the house. Add a room or two." Naomi turned in his arms to face him. "Why would we need more rooms?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "In case we need them. Eventually." Understanding hit, and with it a flutter of something between hope and fear. They'd been married 4 months. They were careful most of the time, but not always. The possibility had been there from the beginning. "I'm not pregnant," she said. "I know, but you might be someday. If you want that." "Do you want that?" Elias was quiet for a moment, his hands warm on her waist. "I wanted it with Sarah. Thought we'd have a house full of kids running around by now. When she died, I figured that was done. But now," he paused, "now I think maybe it doesn't have to be." Naomi's throat tightened. She hadn't let herself think about children, hadn't dared hope for that kind of future. Children required stability, safety, things she'd spent so long without that they still felt foreign. "I don't know if I'd be any good at it," she admitted. "At what? Being a mother?" "At any of it. Raising kids, keeping them safe, being what they need." She looked away. "My mother tried her best and still ended up dying when I needed her most. What if I'm the same?" "You won't be. You don't know that. I know you've survived things that would have broken most people. I know you're strong and smart, and you don't give up even when you probably should." He tilted her face back toward him. "Those are exactly the qualities kids need, not perfection, just someone who keeps showing up." The words settled into spaces inside her that had been hollow for too long. Naomi blinked against unexpected tears. "I'd be terrified the whole time." "So would I," Elias smiled slightly. "We'd figure it out together, same as everything else." "What if we can't? What if something goes wrong?" "Then we'll handle it, but we don't have to decide anything right now. I'm just saying the possibility's there if we want it." Naomi nodded, not trusting her voice. Elias pulled her close, and they stood there while snow continued falling outside and the fire crackled behind them, holding each other against the cold and the future and all the uncertainty that came with both. The storm lasted 3 days, and when it finally cleared, they spent a week digging out. The cattle had weathered it well, huddled together in the sheltered areas Miguel had set up. The horses were fine, though restless from being confined. Only minor damage, a section of fence down, some shingles blown off the barn roof, nothing they couldn't handle. Daniel proved his worth during the recovery, working without complaint through cold that made everyone else want to quit. He'd filled out since arriving, no longer the half-starved, desperate kid who'd shown up looking for any kind of chance. Now he moved with confidence, knew what needed doing without being told. "You thinking about asking him to stay on permanently?" Naomi asked Elias one evening while they reviewed accounts. "Already did. He said yes." "When?" "Last week. Figured we could use the extra hands year-round, and he's earned it." Elias glanced at her. "That all right with you?" The fact that he asked, that he considered her opinion equal to his own in decisions about the ranch, still caught her off guard sometimes, in a good way. "More than all right. He's good people." "Yeah, he is." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Naomi updating the ledger while Elias planned next season's breeding strategy. The room was warm, the lamp casting soft light over the papers spread between them. Domestic. Peaceful. The kind of evening Naomi had never imagined having when she'd stepped off that train in Prospect Ridge. "We need to go into town next week," Elias said eventually. "Pick up supplies before the next storm hits." Naomi's hand paused on the ledger. She'd been avoiding Prospect Ridge since the wedding, letting Elias or Miguel handle the supply runs. But she couldn't hide forever, and part of her was tired of trying. "I'll come with you." Elias looked up, surprised. "You sure?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The trip into town happened on a cold, clear morning when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. They took the wagon, Elias driving while Naomi sat beside him, trying not to think about the last time she'd ridden this road toward Prospect Ridge, with hope in her chest and lies in her pocket. "You're quiet," Elias observed. "Just thinking." "About?" "About how different everything is now." She glanced at him. "Last time I came this way, I thought Thomas Farrow was waiting for me. Thought I was heading toward a future someone else had promised. And now? Now I know the only future worth having is the one you build yourself. Elias reached over and took her hand, squeezing once before returning his attention to the road. They didn't need more words than that. Prospect Ridge looked the same as it always had. Rough buildings, muddy streets, people moving with purpose between the cold and their destinations. Naomi climbed down from the wagon and felt every eye turn her direction. Let them look. She was Mrs. Vance now, married, legal, and proper, running a successful ranch with her husband. They could think whatever they wanted. The general store was warm and crowded. Naomi took the supply list and started gathering items while Elias talked to the owner about ordering equipment for spring. She was comparing prices on flour when a woman's voice cut through the ambient noise. Well, if it isn't the mail-order bride who got exactly what she deserved. Naomi turned to find a woman about her age, well-dressed in clothes too fine for Prospect Ridge, looking at her with malicious satisfaction. It took a moment to place her. Clara something, one of the women who'd been standing outside the saloon the day Thomas Farrow had humiliated her. "I prefer Mrs. Vance, actually," Naomi said evenly. "Oh, I heard about that. Quick wedding. People wondered if there was a reason for the rush." Clara's smile was sharp. "Guess we'll know in a few months, won't we?" Several nearby conversations quieted, people listening without pretending not to. Naomi felt heat rise in her face but kept her voice level. "My marriage is none of your concern. Maybe not, but it is entertaining watching you try to play respectable after the way you arrived here. Some stains don't wash out, no matter how hard you scrub." Naomi's hands clenched on the flour sack she was holding. A year ago, she would have fled. 6 months ago, she might have tried to argue. Now, she just looked at Clara with clear eyes and spoke a truth she'd earned the hard way. "You're right, some stains don't wash out. But I've learned something you clearly haven't. Getting knocked down doesn't define you. How you get back up does." She set the flour in her basket. "I got back up. Built something real. That's more than most people manage, stain or not." Clara's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing her features. Before she could respond, Elias appeared at Naomi's side. "Everything all right here?" "Fine," Naomi said. "Just finishing up." She moved past Clara without another word, Elias following. They completed their shopping in silence, loaded the wagon, and were climbing onto the bench when a man approached. Thomas Farrow. He looked older than Naomi remembered, dissipation showing in his face despite barely 2 years passing. His clothes were rumpled, and he moved with the careful precision of someone managing a hangover. "Naomi," he said, like they were old friends. "Heard you landed on your feet." Every muscle in Naomi's body tensed. Beside her, Elias went very still in a way that suggested violence barely held in check. "It's Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice cold. "And you'll address me properly or not at all?" Thomas blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "Now, don't be like that. I know things started rough between us, but things didn't start rough. You lied to me, humiliated me publicly, and left me stranded without resources. That's not rough. That's cruelty. It was just a joke. It was someone's life you were playing with." Naomi stood in the wagon, looking down at him. "You thought you were so clever, fooling the desperate woman from Philadelphia. But you know what? That joke you played was the best thing that could have happened to me." Thomas frowned. "How do you figure?" "Because it forced me to stop believing in promises and start building something real. It taught me that character isn't something other people give you. It's something you prove through action. And it led me exactly where I needed to be, with people who actually value what I bring." She paused. "So thank you, Thomas. Your cruelty made me stronger than your kindness ever could have." She sat back down, and Elias clicked to the horses without a word. As they pulled away, Naomi didn't look back. There was nothing in Prospect Ridge she needed to see anymore. They were halfway home before Elias spoke. "You handled that better than I would have." "How would you have handled it?" "Probably would have hit him." "I thought about it." "What stopped you?" Naomi considered the question. "Realizing he doesn't matter. None of them do. They're stuck in that town playing the same games, nursing the same grudges, while we're out here building something that actually means something." Elias glanced at her with something like awe. "When did you get so wise?" "When I stopped running from who I am." The rest of the journey passed in comfortable silence. When the ranch came into view, Naomi felt something in her chest ease. Home. Not just a place she worked or a roof over her head, but actually home. Miguel met them at the barn, his expression urgent. One of the mares is foaling, having trouble. Elias was out of the wagon before it fully stopped. Naomi jumped down and followed, her earlier triumph forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. The mare was in distress, sweating and thrashing. Miguel had her in a stall, speaking softly in Spanish while trying to assess the situation. "Foal's coming wrong," he said when Elias knelt beside him. "Might need to turn it." What followed was tense, bloody work. Elias and Miguel worked together, trying to reposition the foal while keeping the mare calm. Naomi held the mare's head, murmuring nonsense words while the animal's eyes rolled white with pain and fear. "Almost there," Miguel grunted. "Just need there." The foal came in a rush of fluid and membrane, landing in the straw, small and impossibly fragile. For a long moment it didn't move. Then Miguel cleared its airways and it gasped, ribs expanding, legs kicking weakly. The mare struggled to her feet and turned to her baby, beginning the instinctive work of cleaning and bonding. Miguel sat back on his heels, exhausted. "That was close. Too close," Elias agreed. He looked at Naomi, still kneeling in the straw with blood on her dress and tears on her face. "You all right? I thought we were going to lose them both." "So did I." They stayed in the barn until the foal was standing, wobbly but determined, and nursing. Only then did they return to the house, all three of them wrung out from the intensity of it. "This is the work," Miguel said as they washed up. "Beautiful sometimes, brutal others. You don't get to choose which." "No," Naomi agreed, scrubbing blood from under her fingernails. "You just show up and handle what comes." That night, lying in bed with Elias's arm around her, Naomi thought about the day, the confrontation in town, the difficult birth in the barn, the constant push and pull between triumph and crisis that defined their life here. "You ever regret this?" she asked quietly. "Taking me on? Marrying me? All of it?" "Not once." His answer came without hesitation. "You?" "No. But sometimes I wonder if I'm doing it right. Being a wife, being a partner, all the things I never expected to be." "You're doing fine." "How do you know?" "Because you show up. Every day. No matter how hard it gets, you show up and do the work." He pulled her closer. "That's all anyone can do." Naomi let herself believe him, settling into sleep with the sound of wind outside and warmth inside, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges she'd face the same way she'd faced everything else, head on, with Elias beside her. Winter eventually loosened its grip. Spring came grudging and slow, snow melting to reveal landscape brown and beaten but alive underneath. The horses thrived, the cattle multiplied, and the ranch continued growing in ways both measurable and not. Naomi found herself taking on new roles, expanding beyond household management into actual ranching. She learned to spot illness in livestock, to calculate breeding schedules, to negotiate with buyers who tried to underestimate her. Miguel taught her about horses with patience born from genuine respect. Caleb and Daniel deferred to her judgment on matters she would have felt unqualified to address a year earlier. She'd become essential in ways that went beyond what she could cook or how well she kept accounts. She'd become a true partner in every sense. One evening in April, she and Elias were walking the property, checking fence lines and enjoying the first truly warm day of the year. The grass was starting to green up, and birds were returning from wherever they'd spent the winter. "I've been thinking about what you said," Naomi said as they walked. "About expanding the house." "Yeah? I think we should do it. Not because we need to right now, but because we might. Eventually." Elias stopped walking and looked at her. "You saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I want that future with you, whatever it looks like." The smile that broke across his face was worth every moment of fear that had come before it. He pulled her into a kiss that was equal parts joy and promise, and when they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder than the walk warranted, his eyes were bright. "When?" "I don't know. Maybe soon. Maybe not for a while. But I want to be ready when it happens. Then we'll get ready." He took her hand and they continued walking, fingers intertwined. "We'll expand the house, make sure everything's stable, build the kind of place where kids could grow up safe. And loved. That too." They walked in silence for a while, and Naomi felt something settle in her chest that she'd been carrying unsettled for too long. Hope. Not the fragile kind that shattered easily, but the durable kind that survived hardship and came out stronger. The kind worth building a life around. Summer brought work that never seemed to end. Fence repairs, cattle drives, breaking horses for sale, endless maintenance on buildings and equipment. But it also brought success. Miguel's breeding program had attracted serious attention, and buyers came from territories away to see their stock. They sold half a dozen horses at prices that made even Elias smile. "We're going to make it," he said one night, reviewing the accounts with satisfaction. "Not just survive, actually make it." "We already made it," Naomi corrected. "Now we're thriving." "When did you become such an optimist?" "When I realized pessimism was just another form of giving up." The ranch continued evolving. They hired another hand, a quiet man named Joseph, who'd worked ranches all his life and brought skills they desperately needed. They expanded the barn, built better corrals, and even started talking about buying adjacent land to increase their grazing range. Through it all, Naomi felt herself changing in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She walked taller, spoke with more authority, made decisions without second-guessing herself into paralysis. The woman who'd stepped off that train, terrified and desperate, had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth and refused to apologize for claiming space in the world. In July, she missed her monthly cycle, then another. By August, she was certain enough to tell Elias. He took the news with a combination of joy and terror that mirrored exactly what she was feeling. They held each other in the darkness of their bedroom, both scared and excited and completely unprepared for what was coming. "We can do this," Elias said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "We don't have a choice now." "Would you want one?" Naomi thought about it honestly. "No. Scared as I am, I want this. I want our child. I want the future we're building." "Then that's what we'll have." The pregnancy was harder than expected. Naomi spent the first month sick most mornings, exhausted all the time, barely able to keep food down. She continued working because sitting still felt worse, but everything took twice as long and 3 times as much effort. Miguel watched her with concern and finally spoke up in September. "You need to ease up. Let us handle more." "I'm fine." "You're stubborn. There's a difference." "Miguel's right," Elias added, backing him up. "You're wearing yourself down. Someone has to manage things. Someone does, but that someone doesn't have to be you every minute of every day." Elias's tone was gentle but firm. "We've got enough hands now, delegate. Trust us to handle it." It went against every instinct she'd developed since arriving at the ranch. But Naomi forced herself to step back, to let the men handle tasks she'd always managed, to accept that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was harder than any physical labor she'd ever done. By October, her body had adjusted enough that the sickness eased and energy returned. She was showing now, her belly rounded in ways that made simple tasks awkward and clothes fit wrong. But she felt strangely powerful too, growing a whole human being while still running a ranch. They finished expanding the house just before the first snow. A new room off the main bedroom, small but well built, with windows that let in good light and a stove that would keep it warm through winter. Naomi stood in the empty space, imagining it filled with a cradle, with the sounds of a baby's cry, with the mess and chaos and joy that would come. "You're smiling," Elias observed from the doorway. "I'm terrified." "That why you're smiling?" "I'm smiling because despite being terrified, I'm also happy. I didn't think those could exist together, but apparently they can." He crossed to her and placed his hand on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath his palm. "We're going to mess this up sometimes." "Probably. But we'll figure it out." "We better." Naomi covered his hand with hers. "This kid's counting on us." "Then we won't let them down." It was a promise neither of them could guarantee keeping, but they meant it with everything they had. That would have to be enough. Winter came again, but this time Naomi spent it preparing. She sewed small clothes from fabric she bought in town, ignoring the stares and whispers that still followed her. She read every book on childbirth and infant care she could find, trying to prepare for something no book could really prepare you for. She let the men take over most of the heavy work while she focused on keeping herself and the baby healthy. Miguel became unexpectedly protective, constantly making sure she ate enough, that she didn't overdo it, that she rested when she needed to. Caleb and Daniel deferred to her even more than before, treating her pregnancy like it made her both fragile and sacred. Only Elias treated her normally, which Naomi appreciated more than any amount of careful handling. "You're still you," he said when she mentioned it. "Pregnant doesn't change that. Tell that to everyone else. They're trying to help. They're trying to wrap me in cotton and put me on a shelf." Elias laughed at that, and the sound warmed her more than the fire ever could. The baby came in late February, during a storm that made the one from 2 years ago look gentle. Naomi's labor started just after midnight, and by dawn she understood why women spoke of childbirth in terms usually reserved for war. Miguel rode to town through the storm to fetch the midwife while Elias stayed with Naomi, holding her hand through contractions that felt like they'd split her apart. The midwife arrived just before noon, a no-nonsense woman who'd delivered half the babies in Prospect Ridge and lost her capacity for sentiment years ago. "You'll do fine," she told Naomi. "You're built strong and the baby's positioned right. Just listen to your body and push when I tell you." What followed was hours of pain and effort that reduced Naomi's world to nothing but the next breath, the next push, the next wave of agony. Elias stayed beside her the whole time, letting her crush his hand, murmuring encouragement that she barely heard through the roaring in her ears. Then, just as the storm outside reached its peak, the baby came. A girl, small and red and screaming her displeasure at being thrust into cold air and bright light. "She's healthy," the midwife announced, cleaning the baby efficiently. "Good lungs on her." Naomi barely heard. All her attention was on the tiny person the midwife placed in her arms, this impossible creature she and Elias had created. The baby stopped crying when she felt Naomi's warmth, her eyes, dark and unfocused, but seeing something, blinking up at her mother. "Hello," Naomi whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama. I've been waiting for you." Elias leaned over them both, his expression awed. "She's perfect. She's wrinkled and angry." "Perfect," he repeated, touching one tiny fist with a gentleness that contrasted everything else about him. They named her Clara Rose. Clara for Naomi's mother, Rose, because it was the first flower that would bloom in spring, and Naomi liked the idea of her daughter sharing a name with something that persisted despite harsh conditions. The first weeks were brutal. Clara cried more than she slept, nursed constantly, and reduced both Naomi and Elias to exhausted shells of their former selves. But underneath the exhaustion was wonder. This tiny person who depended on them completely, who had Elias's coloring and Naomi's stubborn streak, who was teaching them both what it meant to love someone more than your own comfort. Miguel visited daily, bringing meals and practical help with a competence that suggested he'd done this before. When Naomi asked about it, his face went distant. "Had a daughter once, long time ago. She and her mother died in childbirth." He looked at Clara sleeping in Naomi's arms. "Make sure you appreciate what you've got. Not everyone gets this lucky." The words stayed with Naomi long after Miguel left. She held Clara tighter that night, breathing in the sweet smell of her, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest. Lucky didn't begin to cover it. Spring came slowly, snow melting to reveal a world fresh and new. As soon as the weather permitted, Naomi started taking Clara outside, showing her the ranch that would be her inheritance. The horses, the cattle, the wide sky that stretched forever. All of it hers someday, if she wanted it. "You think she'll stay?" Elias asked one morning, watching Naomi walk with Clara. "Or will she want something different?" "I think we raise her to know she has choices, same as we did." Naomi adjusted the blanket around Clara's face. "And whatever she chooses, we support her. Even if she wants to leave? Even then. We teach her to be strong enough to build her own life, wherever that leads." It was the lesson Naomi had learned the hardest way possible, and she was determined her daughter wouldn't have to learn it the same way. Clara would grow up knowing she was valued, knowing she had people who believed in her, knowing that she could create her own future instead of waiting for someone else to hand her one. The ranch continued thriving. They sold more horses, expanded the herd, and started making a name for themselves throughout the territory. People who dismissed Elias as a struggling rancher now sought his advice. People who'd mocked Naomi for being Thomas Farrow's joke now treated her with cautious respect. She took no satisfaction in their change of attitude. She'd learned that other people's opinions were weather, constantly shifting, ultimately irrelevant. What mattered was the life she'd built and the people she'd built it with. Summer brought another addition. Miguel announced his intention to retire from heavy ranch work and focus solely on the breeding program. Elias promoted Joseph to foreman, and they hired 2 more hands to replace the labor Miguel would no longer provide. "You've earned the rest," Naomi told Miguel. "Take it." "Not rest, just different work." He smiled at Clara, who was attempting to grab his weathered hand. "And more time to teach this one about horses." "She's 6 months old." Never too early to start. By fall, Clara was crawling, getting into everything and terrorizing the ranch hands with her fearless exploration. She pulled herself up on fence rails to watch the horses, grabbed at chickens in the yard, and shrieked with delight whenever Elias came home. "She's going to be trouble," Caleb observed, watching Clara determinedly pursue the barn cat. "She's already trouble," Naomi corrected. "She just doesn't know how to talk back yet. Give her time." That winter was easier than any before it. They had resources, experienced hands, and systems in place that worked. When storms came, they weathered them. When livestock got sick, they treated it. When equipment broke, they fixed or replaced it. The ranch had become what Elias had envisioned when he first started it. A working operation that supported everyone involved and showed promise of continuing for generations. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside and the house warm with firelight, Naomi sat in the rocking chair Elias had built, nursing Clara while he added another log to the fire. Miguel and the other hands were celebrating in the bunkhouse, their laughter carrying across the yard. "You ever think about how we got here?" Elias asked, settling into the chair beside her. "All the time." And I think sometimes the worst things lead to the best things, if you're willing to keep going long enough to see it. He reached over and took her free hand. "I'm glad you kept going." "Me too." They sat there in comfortable silence, the baby nursing, the fire crackling, the world outside cold and harsh, but unable to touch them in this moment. Naomi thought about the girl who'd stepped off that train in Prospect Ridge, broken and humiliated, with nothing but desperate hope keeping her upright. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who'd built a life from raw determination and refusal to quit, who'd found love in the last place she expected and created something that would outlast them both. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been smooth, but it had been real. And that made all the difference. Clara finished nursing and drifted off to sleep, her small body warm and trusting in Naomi's arms. Elias stood and took his daughter carefully, holding her with practiced ease now that he'd had months to learn. "I'll put her down," he murmured. Naomi watched him carry Clara to the nursery, then stood and walked to the window. The ranch spread out before her, snow-covered and peaceful, everything she'd helped build visible in the moonlight. Home. Not because someone had promised it to her or given it as a gift, but because she'd claimed it, worked for it, fought to keep it. And she wasn't done yet. The years that followed brought changes both expected and not. Clara grew from infant to toddler to a small person with opinions about everything and fear of nothing. By the time she turned 3, she was following Miguel around the corrals, mimicking his gestures with horses, and absorbing everything he taught her with the intensity of someone born to the work. "She's got the gift," Miguel told Naomi one afternoon, watching Clara approach a skittish yearling with complete confidence. "Seen it maybe 3 times in my life. Horses trust her." "She's 3 years old. Isn't it too early to tell?" "It's never too early. Either you have it or you don't." He glanced at Naomi. "You should let me teach her properly. Start her young while the instinct's fresh." Naomi watched her daughter, so small against the horse's bulk, and felt the familiar pull between wanting to protect and needing to let grow. It was a tension that defined parenthood, she'd learned, this constant negotiation between safety and possibility. "Teach her," she said finally. "But you keep her safe." "With my life." The ranch continued expanding. They bought the adjacent property when the owner died and his children wanted nothing to do with Montana winters. More land meant more cattle, more horses, more work. Elias hired additional hands, and the operation grew into something that required real management instead of everyone doing everything. Naomi found herself taking on more of the business side: contracts, sales, negotiations with buyers who sometimes traveled from as far as California to see their stock. She was good at it, better than Elias, and he had the sense to recognize that and step back. "You should have been running your own operation from the start," he said one evening after she'd closed a deal that would keep them comfortable for 2 years. I didn't know how back then. You would have figured it out. You always do. The compliment warmed her, but what mattered more was that he meant it. Elias had never been the type to offer empty praise. When he said she was capable, it came from genuine observation, not husbandly obligation. In the spring of Clara's 4th year, Naomi discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news came with less terror and more weary acceptance. She knew what was coming now: the sickness, the exhaustion, the way pregnancy would slow her down right when the ranch needed her most. "We'll manage," Elias said when she told him. "We did it once. Barely. But we did. And we're better set up now. More hands, more resources, Miguel to help with Clara." He pulled her close. "We've got this." She wanted to believe him. Mostly, she did. The pregnancy was harder than the first. Naomi was older now, worn down by years of ranch work and the demands of raising a child who never stopped moving. She continued working because stopping felt like surrender, but everything hurt and nothing came easy. Clara sensed something was different and responded by becoming impossibly clingy, refusing to let Naomi out of her sight. Naomi tried to be patient, but patience was hard to find when you were exhausted and uncomfortable and still had a ranch to help run. "She's scared," Elias observed one night after Clara had finally cried herself to sleep. "She doesn't understand what's happening." I've tried explaining. "She's 4. She doesn't think in months and future siblings. She just knows Mom is different, and she doesn't like it." Naomi rubbed her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick. "What am I supposed to do about that?" "Give her time. Give yourself grace. Stop trying to be everything to everyone." Easy for you to say. Not really, but I'm saying it anyway. The baby, another girl, delivered in early winter with less drama than Clara, but just as much pain, arrived healthy and squalling. They named her Margaret, after no one in particular, just because Naomi liked the way it sounded. Clara took one look at her new sister and announced she didn't want her. "She's too loud and she's ugly," Clara declared with the brutal honesty of childhood. "You were loud and ugly too when you were born," Elias said, trying not to laugh. "Was not. We're 2. Ask your mother." Naomi, exhausted and sore and in no mood for negotiations, simply said, "You're stuck with her either way. Might as well get used to it." It took weeks before Clara warmed to Margaret, and even then the relationship was complicated. Clara resented the attention the baby required, hated how tired it made Naomi, but also showed fierce protectiveness when anyone else came near. "That's my sister," she'd announced to ranch hands who dared to peek at Margaret. "You can't hold her." "Wasn't asking to," Caleb would say, amused. "Good. Because you can't." Raising 2 children while running a ranch tested Naomi in ways she hadn't anticipated. There were days when she wanted to scream from exhaustion, nights when she cried from frustration, moments when she questioned every decision that had led her here. But there were also mornings when Clara would bring her wildflowers picked from the pasture, afternoons when Margaret would smile up at her with pure trust, evenings when Elias would take both girls so Naomi could have an hour to herself. Those moments didn't erase the hard parts, but they made them bearable. Miguel took sick the summer Margaret turned 1. It started as a cough that wouldn't quit, then developed into something deeper that left him weak and struggling for breath. The doctor from Prospect Ridge came out, examined him, and gave them a prognosis no one wanted to hear. "His lungs are failing. Could be months. Could be a year. But he's not getting better." Miguel took the news with the same stoic acceptance he applied to everything else. "Figured it was coming. Can't work horses forever." "You don't have to work at all," Elias said. "We'll take care of you." "I know, but I'd rather be useful as long as I can." Miguel looked at Clara, who was sitting in the corner pretending not to listen. "Still got things to teach that one." He spent his remaining strength passing everything he knew to Clara. Horse breeding, training techniques, bloodline management, all of it transferred from his failing mind to her eager one. She absorbed it the way dry ground absorbed rain, desperate and complete. Naomi watched them together and felt grief building for a loss that hadn't happened yet. Miguel had been part of the ranch since before she arrived, had helped build it into what it was, had stood witness to her transformation from desperate stranger to capable partner. Losing him would tear a hole in the fabric of their life. He died on a clear October morning, passing quietly in his sleep. They found him in the bunkhouse, looking peaceful, like he'd simply decided he was done and let go. Clara cried for 3 days straight. Naomi held her daughter and felt her own grief mixing with Clara's, this small person experiencing real loss for the first time. "Why did he have to die?" Clara demanded through tears. "Because everything dies eventually. That's how life works." "I don't like it." "Neither do I. But we don't get to choose." They buried Miguel on a hillside overlooking the corrals he'd built, with a view of the horses he'd loved. The whole ranch turned out, plus people from town who'd known him, and even a few strangers who'd heard about his skill and wanted to pay respects. Naomi stood between Elias and Clara, holding Margaret on her hip, and felt the weight of time passing. Miguel was gone. The ranch would continue without him. Life had this way of moving forward whether you were ready or not. "He was a good man," Elias said that night. "The best. Clara's going to miss him. We all will." They held each other in the darkness, seeking comfort in shared warmth and the solidity of another person still breathing, still present. Death had a way of making you appreciate what remained. The ranch adjusted to Miguel's absence the way living things adjust to anything, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. Clara threw herself into horsework with intensity that worried Naomi until she realized it was her daughter's way of grieving. Joseph stepped up to handle what Miguel had managed, and they hired another hand with experience in breeding to fill the gap. Life continued because it had to. The years accumulated. Clara turned 8, then 10, then 12, growing tall and competent and increasingly independent. Margaret followed 2 years behind, different from her sister in temperament, but equally stubborn. Where Clara was all action and instinct, Margaret thought everything through, planned ahead, asked questions that sometimes had no good answers. "Why do people say you weren't respectable when you came here?" Margaret asked one afternoon, 8 years old and curious about everything. Naomi's hand stilled on the bread dough she was kneading. "Where'd you hear that?" "In town. Mrs. Hadley was talking to someone about how you've certainly made something of yourself despite your origins." Margaret's mimicry of the woman's pinched tone was disturbingly accurate. "What does that mean?" Clara, sitting nearby mending a bridle, looked up with interest. At 14, she'd heard the stories but never asked directly. Now both girls waited for an answer. Naomi washed her hands and sat down, deciding truth was better than evasion. "When I first came to Montana, I came because a man wrote me letters promising marriage. When I got here, I found out those letters were a joke. He'd been lying the whole time, and he made sure everyone knew I'd been fooled. That's what Mrs. Hadley means by my origins." "That's cruel," Margaret said immediately. "It was. But it led me to your father, to this ranch, to you two. So maybe it was also the best thing that could have happened." Clara frowned, working through the logic. "But you didn't deserve to be treated that way." "No. But what I deserved and what I got were two different things. I learned to work with what I got. And now Mrs. Hadley has to be polite to you, even though she probably still thinks you're not respectable," Margaret concluded with satisfaction. "That must make her mad." "Probably. But I don't spend much time thinking about what Mrs. Hadley feels." "Why not?" "Because her opinion of me doesn't define me. Only I get to do that." It was a lesson Naomi had learned through years of hard experience, and she wanted her daughters to understand it earlier than she had. The world would judge them for being women, for being ranch-raised, for whatever reasons people invented to feel superior. They needed armor against that, built from self-knowledge and refusal to accept other people's limitations. Clara absorbed this and went back to her work. But later, Naomi overheard her telling Margaret, "Mama's tougher than anyone in Prospect Ridge. They're just scared to admit it." The words settled warm in Naomi's chest. Her daughters saw her clearly, and what they saw was strength. That was enough. When Clara turned 16, she announced she wanted to take over the horse operation entirely. "You're still in school," Naomi pointed out. "I can do both." "I already do most of the work anyway." This was true. Clara had been managing breeding schedules, training protocols, and buyer relationships for 2 years, with Joseph handling only the physical labor she couldn't manage alone. "What does your father think?" Naomi asked. "He said to ask you." Of course he had. Elias had learned long ago to defer to Naomi on anything involving their daughters' futures. Naomi looked at Clara, nearly as tall as Elias now, confident in ways Naomi had never been at that age, ready to claim what she'd been preparing for her whole life. "If you're going to do it, you do it right. That means keeping your schooling current, managing accounts properly, and accepting that I'll be checking your work. Clara's face broke into a grin. Deal. She proved herself within 6 months, expanding their buyer network and implementing breeding strategies that improved their stock quality. By 17, she was corresponding with ranchers across 3 territories and negotiating deals that made even Naomi proud. Margaret took a different path, showing more interest in the business side than the animals. At 12, she was already keeping better books than anyone else, spotting inefficiencies and suggesting improvements that actually worked. She's got your mind for numbers, Elias observed, watching Margaret reorganize their filing system with ruthless efficiency. And your stubbornness, that's all you. They were both right. The girls carried pieces of each parent, mixed and recombined into people who were entirely themselves. The ranch continued thriving. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market downturns and equipment failures. All the challenges that came with working land that didn't particularly care about human plans. But they'd built something resilient enough to bend without breaking, and that made all the difference. Naomi turned 40, then 45, her body showing the accumulated wear of decades of hard work. Her hands were permanently calloused, her face lined from sun and wind, her back prone to aching when weather changed. She looked nothing like the young woman who'd stepped off the train in Prospect Ridge, terrified and desperate. She looked better. "You've gone gray," Elias observed one morning, silver threads catching the light in her hair. "So have you. Looks good on you." Liar. True anyway. They'd been married 20 years, and Naomi still discovered new things about him. The way he hummed while working, his unexpected gentleness with injured animals, his tendency to worry silently instead of voicing concerns. He probably knew similar things about her, accumulated details that created intimacy deeper than passion. This was what lasted. Not the dramatic moments or grand gestures, but the quiet accumulation of days spent working toward shared goals, supporting each other through losses, celebrating small victories together. In the spring of Naomi's 46th year, Prospect Ridge organized a territorial fair, showcasing ranching operations. Clara insisted they enter their horses, certain they'd win recognition for stock quality. Naomi agreed reluctantly, not eager to spend time in town being judged by people whose opinions she'd stopped valuing years ago. But Clara wanted it, and Naomi had learned to pick her battles. The fair sprawled across 3 days of exhibitions, competitions, and trading. The Vance Ranch brought 6 horses, representing their best breeding work. Clara managed everything with competence that surprised even Naomi, handling judges' questions and buyer inquiries with equal skill. By the second day, word had spread about their stock. People who'd dismissed Elias years ago as a struggling rancher now wanted to discuss breeding partnerships. Women who'd whispered about Naomi's disgrace now smiled politely and complimented her daughters. Naomi accepted their attention with cool courtesy, neither welcoming nor rejecting it. These people didn't matter. They never had. On the final day, the judges announced results. The Vance Ranch took first place in 3 categories, second in 2 others. Clara accepted the ribbons with pride, and Naomi watched her daughter shine with accomplishment earned through years of dedicated work. After the ceremony, a woman approached. It took Naomi a moment to recognize Clara Hadley, the same woman who'd mocked her in the general store years ago. She looked older now, worn down by a life Naomi knew nothing about and didn't particularly care to learn. "Mrs. Vance," Clara Hadley said, her tone careful, "I wanted to congratulate you on your success. Your ranch has become quite impressive." "Thank you." Naomi kept her voice neutral. "I also wanted to—" Clara paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize for the things I said when you first came here. I was cruel, and you didn't deserve it." Naomi studied the woman, trying to assess whether this apology was genuine or another form of social maneuvering. In the end, it didn't matter. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, "but I stopped carrying that particular hurt a long time ago." "You're forgiven, mainly because holding on to it would have hurt me more than you." Clara Hadley blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Thank you. That's generous." "Not really, just practical." The woman nodded and moved away, leaving Naomi standing in the spring sunshine thinking about all the years between that first humiliation and this moment. The distance wasn't just time, it was growth, transformation, the hard work of becoming someone who couldn't be diminished by other people's cruelty, because she knew her own worth too well. That evening, the whole family gathered for supper at a restaurant in town, a rare indulgence. Clara and Margaret were animated, talking over each other about the fair's events. Elias sat back with satisfaction, watching his daughters shine. Naomi looked at all of them and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for decades. Peace. Not because life had become easy, but because she'd finally stopped fighting battles that didn't matter and started appreciating what she'd built. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked, catching her expression. "How far we've come." "Long way from that train station." "Long way from everywhere I started." He reached across the table and took her hand. 20 years of marriage, and the gesture still meant something, still mattered. Later, walking back to where they'd left the wagon, Naomi found herself alone with her daughters while Elias settled the bill. Margaret had run ahead, but Clara walked beside her mother, matching her pace. "You never talk about him," Clara said suddenly. "Who?" "The man who lied to you, Thomas Farrow." Naomi glanced at her daughter. "What made you think of him? Seeing you at the fair, watching people treat you like you matter. I was thinking about how different it must be from when you first got here." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever see him around town?" "Sometimes. He doesn't look good, drinks too much, works too little. Life hasn't been kind to him." "Does that make you happy, that he's struggling?" It was a fair question. Naomi considered it honestly. "No. Just makes me sad that he wasted whatever potential he had being cruel for entertainment. But mostly, I don't think about him at all. He's not part of my life. Hasn't been for a long time." "But he could have ruined everything if Papa hadn't given you a chance." "But he did. And even if he hadn't, I'd have found another way." That's what you do when you're desperate. You find a way, or you make one. Clara absorbed this, then asked the question Naomi sensed she'd been building toward. "Did you love Papa right away?" "No, I barely knew him. Love came later, built from working together and choosing each other day after day." Naomi looked at her daughter. "Why are you asking?" "Jacob Pritchard asked if he could court me." Daniel's younger brother, who'd come to work for them 2 years ago. He was Clara's age, hardworking and earnest, and Naomi had seen the way he looked at her daughter. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it, but I'm not sure I want that. Marriage, I mean. I've got the horses and the ranch, and that feels like enough." Claire's expression was troubled. "Is that wrong?" "Not wrong, just different." Naomi stopped walking and turned to face her daughter fully. "Listen to me. You don't have to follow anyone else's path. Not mine, not your father's, not what people expect. You figure out what makes you feel complete, and you build that life. If it includes Jacob or someone else, fine. If it doesn't, that's fine too. The only person who gets to decide what your life should look like is you. But you're happy with Papa, with all of this." "I am. But my happiness came from choosing the right partner and building something together. Someone else's happiness might come from staying independent or from pursuing different dreams entirely. There's no single right answer." Clara nodded slowly, the tension easing from her shoulders. "I think I need more time." "Then take it. Anyone worth having will wait." They continued walking, and Naomi felt the conversation settle between them like a gift. This was what she could give her daughters, not a perfect life or guaranteed happiness, but the tools to build their own futures. Permission to choose differently. Freedom to be themselves without apology. It was more than she'd had, and watching it take root in Clara and Margaret made every hard year worth it. The seasons continued turning. Margaret graduated from school and announced she wanted to study business management at a college 2 territories east. Naomi felt her heart clench at the thought of her youngest leaving, but she helped Margaret prepare anyway. "You'll come back?" she asked the night before Margaret departed. "Eventually, but I need to see what else is out there first." Margaret hugged her mother. "You taught me that. How to build my own life instead of just accepting what's handed to me." "I taught you to survive. You learned the rest yourself." "You taught me more than that. You taught me that being knocked down isn't the end. That you can rebuild. That strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up." Margaret pulled back, her eyes bright. "I'm only brave enough to leave because I saw you be brave first." The words hit Naomi harder than expected. She'd never thought of herself as brave, just stubborn and unwilling to quit. But maybe there wasn't much difference. Margaret left on a bright autumn morning, and the ranch felt emptier without her energy and endless questions. But Naomi took comfort knowing her daughter was out there building her own story, making her own choices, living proof that the next generation didn't have to repeat the limitations of the last. Clara stayed, taking over the horse operation completely now that she'd turned 21. She never did accept Jacob Pritchard's courtship, but she remained friends with him, and Naomi occasionally wondered if that might change. It didn't matter either way. Clara seemed content with her life, and that was enough. Elias's health started declining when he hit 60. Nothing dramatic, just the slow erosion of strength that came with decades of physical labor and Montana winters. He moved slower, tired easier, let others handle tasks that used to be his alone. "I'm getting old," he said one evening, watching the sunset from the porch. "We both are." "You wear it better," Naomi laughed. "Your vision's going, if you think that. Not my vision, my appreciation." He looked at her with the same intensity he'd had at 40. "You know that, right? How much I appreciate everything you've built here." "We built it. You transformed it. I was just surviving until you showed up and insisted on more." He took her hand. "I never told you that properly. How grateful I am you stayed." "Where else was I going to go? Anywhere. You could have gone anywhere. But you stayed, and you made this place into something that'll outlast both of us. That matters, Naomi, more than I know how to say." She squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength still present even if diminished. They'd built this together, the ranch, the family, the life that would continue after they were gone. That was enough. That was everything. 3 years later, on a cold February morning, Elias didn't wake up. Naomi found him still and peaceful, gone in his sleep the way Miguel had gone, choosing when to let go. The grief was different than she expected, not sharp and immediate, but deep and pervasive, seeping into everything. She'd known him for over 30 years, been married to him for 29, built everything that mattered with him. His absence left a hole nothing could fill. Clara came home immediately when she heard, bringing comfort through presence rather than words. Margaret arrived 2 days later, having traveled as fast as possible. Together, the three women prepared for the funeral, managed the ranch, and held each other through the worst of the grief. They buried Elias beside Miguel on the hillside, giving him the view of the ranch he'd loved. Half the territory turned out, ranchers he'd traded with, hands he'd employed, people whose lives he'd touched in ways big and small. Naomi stood between her daughters and felt the weight of time pressing down. She was 62 years old. Everyone she'd loved most was gone except Clara and Margaret. The ranch would continue, but the future belonged to them now. That thought brought less sadness than she expected. She'd done what she came here to do, survived, built something lasting, raised children who were strong enough to carry it forward. The story was entering its final chapter, but the ending was good. The years after Elias's death passed quietly. Naomi stepped back from active ranch management, letting Clara run operations while she handled only what needed her specific expertise. Margaret returned home after finishing her studies, bringing ideas about modernizing their business practices that Clara initially resisted but eventually accepted. Watching her daughters work together, argue and compromise and build on what their parents had created, Naomi felt satisfaction deeper than pride. This was legacy, not just property or money, but the continuation of values, the passing forward of hard-won wisdom, the knowledge that what you built would outlast you. On a spring morning, 32 years after arriving in Montana, Naomi walked into Prospect Ridge alone. She was 70 years old, her body worn but still functional, her mind sharp despite the years. She had errands to run, supplies to buy, the mundane business of continuing life. As she moved through the town, she noticed something that would have been impossible to imagine that first day. People greeted her with respect. Shopkeepers called her Mrs. Vance and meant it as honor, not mockery. Younger women asked her advice about ranching, about business, about navigating a world that still didn't make things easy for women. She'd become an institution without meaning to. The woman who'd survived public humiliation and built an empire from nothing. A living example of what was possible when you refused to let circumstances define your limits. She was standing outside the general store, loading purchases into her wagon, when she saw Thomas Farrow. He looked ancient, though he couldn't be more than 75. Drink and dissolution had carved his face into something barely recognizable. He moved slowly, painfully, the swagger of youth long gone. He saw her and stopped, recognition flickering in his eyes. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Naomi felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction at his decline, no vindication, just a distant observation that life had taken them in vastly different directions from that moment 32 years ago when he'd thought destroying her was entertainment. "Naomi," he said finally, his voice rough, "I heard about Elias. I'm sorry." "Thank you. You did all right for yourself, better than anyone expected." "I did better than I expected, too." He nodded, shifting his weight. "I've thought about that day sometimes. What I did to you, it was wrong." "Yes, it was. I'm sorry, if that matters." Naomi considered him, this broken man who'd once had power over her shame, who'd thought ruining her was consequence-free fun. He'd paid for that cruelty with a wasted life, and looking at him now, she felt only pity. "It matters," she said finally, "but not as much as you probably think. You were a moment in my life, Thomas. An ugly one, but just a moment. I moved past it a long time ago. But if you hadn't been cruel, I'd have married you and probably been miserable. So in a strange way, your worst impulse gave me my best life." She picked up the reins. "I hope you find some peace before the end. I really do." She drove away without looking back, leaving him standing in the street. That chapter was closed, had been closed for decades. She'd only returned to it long enough to prove to herself that it no longer had power. The final years came gently. Naomi watched Clara marry eventually. Not Jacob Pritchard, but a horse trader from Wyoming who matched her passion for the work. She watched Margaret build a consulting business, helping ranches modernize their operations. She held grandchildren and passed on stories and felt the satisfaction of seeing her daughters thrive. On a summer evening when Naomi was 78, she sat on the porch of the ranch house watching sunset paint the sky. Clara was inside putting her youngest to bed. Margaret was due to arrive tomorrow. The ranch hummed with activity, even at day's end, alive and productive. Naomi thought about the girl who'd stepped off that train, terrified and humiliated, with nowhere to go and no one to help her. She thought about every hard choice, every moment of fear overcome, every time she'd wanted to quit but kept going anyway. That girl had built this, had survived, transformed, created something that would last long after she was gone. It wasn't a perfect life. There had been too much pain for that, too many losses, too many moments when happiness felt impossible. But it was a good life, an honest one, a life she'd chosen and built with her own hands. And in the end, that was more than enough. The sunset faded to twilight. Stars began appearing overhead, countless and cold and beautiful. Naomi sat in the gathering darkness, breathing the familiar smell of grass and horses and home, and felt at peace. She'd done what she came here to do. She'd survived. She'd built something lasting. She'd taught her daughters that you could be knocked down and still get back up, that the cruelest moment could become the catalyst for your best life, that strength wasn't about never falling, but about always rising. That was her legacy. Not the ranch, though that mattered. Not the money or the reputation or the respect she'd earned, but the example she'd lived, that you got to write your own story, even when other people tried to write it for you, especially then. Clara came out and sat beside her, and together they watched the last light fade from the sky. Mother and daughter, two generations of women who'd learned that the only person who got to define your worth was you. And that lesson, more than anything, would outlast them all.